Y aún debía.
What the heck? When did you and Uncle Carlos tie the knot? Megan asked with an innocent look on her face. She let go of Carlos, came over to Debbie, and held her arm like an old friend, though this was the first time they had met. Debbie gave an awkward smile. We got married 3 years ago, but he was always busy, so we weren't able to go out on a date until recently. Oh, I see, Megan responded. Then she turned to Carlos and complained, Uncle Carlos, this is all your fault. You guys have been married for 3 years. So how come we haven't seen her till now? Carlos held Debbie's hand with a smile. You are right.
Me culpa.
I'll make up for it, he promised while looking Debbie in the eye. Debbie blushed. She noticed Carlos was flirting with her again, and every time he did that, her heart started pounding. When the group walked in, a throng of young people already packed the venue where the party was being held. Everyone was having fun. When people saw them, the women went crazy. It's him. It's Carlos Huo. And his friends too. My God, I can't believe I'm seeing Carlos Huo, one of them exclaimed. Wow, they're so hot. I like all 4. What should I do? A second woman said. Megan was right. She really is tight with Mr. Huo. But who's the woman next to him? Another wondered. I dunno. Never seen her before, but she's gorgeous, their friend said. Their discussion went on like that, making this or that comment, usually about their looks. Later, the group split up. Damon was pulled away from his friends by 2 beautiful women. Curtis and Colleen went somewhere alone. Wesley left his friends with Megan while she held his arm. Only Debbie and Carlos stayed put. A waiter came to them offering all kinds of alcohol. Carlos took a glass of wine from the tray. When Debbie thought it was for her, Carlos told the waiter, A glass of lemonade, please. Yes, Mr. Huo. After the waiter had left, Carlos sipped the wine and asked Debbie, There's food over there. Hungry? Debbie didn't respond. She looked at him and asked, Why lemonade? For you, answered Carlos. Debbie was struck speechless. She looked around and everyone else had a glass of something alcoholic. Wine, liquor, champagne, even cocktails. No one was drinking lemonade. Lemonade? Seriously? Yes, Carlos said. Simple, direct, and to the point. He didn't like it when she drank alcohol. Debbie was annoyed, but she knew she couldn't convince Carlos to let up. He was stubborn like that. Soon the lemonade was served. She took the drink resignedly and followed Carlos to the refreshment tables. As usual, cake was her favorite. She picked up a Hokkaido chiffon cupcake. After taking a bite, she asked, Any shows tonight?
Yeah.
Wesley invited Megan's favorite actress. Carlos answered while leaning against the table behind him. Seeing how much the 4 richest and most powerful young men spoiled Megan, Debbie couldn't help asking, Who is she?
Megan Lang.
I know that. I mean, Carlos, Megan was looking for you. Damon cut in, holding one tall, slim woman in each arm. Okay, I'll go check on her. You have some fun, Carlos said to her and left. A minute later, Debbie saw Megan take Carlos' arm and walk into a room with him while they were talking and laughing. Debbie stared at the door, but after 15 minutes or so neither of them left the room. She hesitated about whether to knock on the door or not. To her surprise, Colleen was already standing next to her, holding a glass of champagne. Let's dance, she urged. It was pitch dark outside. Deafening music echoed around the island, and the thumping could be heard everywhere. Tons of young people undulated on the dance floor, hypnotized by the pulsing beats and pleasure. Debbie took one last glance at the room where Carlos was before nodding her assent to Colleen. Once on the dance floor, Colleen shifted from a gentle, quiet young woman into a hot, seductive dancing queen. She shimmied and stepped in time to the music. She wasn't the shy young woman anymore. She was a hottie on the dance floor and no one could stop her. Slowly, even Debbie succumbed to the mesmerizing beats and started to move her body. But Debbie wasn't really in a dancing mood. Her mind was millions of miles away. She was thinking about Carlos and Megan. What are they doing in that room? Am I being paranoid? Like a mind reader, Colleen suddenly stopped dancing. She hugged Debbie and whispered to her, "I thought the same thing. I thought I was just paranoid. But it turned out, just watch out for Megan." Before Debbie could say anything back, Colleen was all smiles as she walked over to Curtis, who was waving at her. Standing on the dance floor, Debbie watched Colleen leave, so confused. What did she mean? Curtis saw Debbie standing alone on the dance floor. When Colleen approached him, he remarked, "I guess you didn't behave while I was away. Did you have fun?" Colleen grabbed his hand and said, "Debbie and I had just started dancing before you brought me here and left her alone. Debbie will be upset. You want to go back? You can dance more," Curtis said with a smile. He knew Colleen better than anyone else. On the outside, she was quiet and tender. On the inside, she was as wild as a panther. "Not on your life. I want to keep an eye on my boyfriend in case some teenage girl steals him away from me." Colleen meant Megan, but Curtis didn't realize that and kissed her forehead. "I saw Megan and Carlos walk into another room. Any idea what they're doing there?" Colleen asked, assuming a casual tone. Curtis didn't answer but flicked her head. "Ow, why did you do that? Don't you love me anymore?" she cried. "Why are you so focused on Carlos?" A friend of Megan's gave her a painting as a birthday gift. It was a landscape painting of the Qing dynasty. She wanted Carlos to verify it wasn't a fake. "Oh, Carlos knows about antiques? I didn't know that. He's seen a lot of them, so he more or less knows." Colleen pursed her lips and didn't say anything. She wanted to go back to Debbie and tell her what she just heard. After thinking about it, she let go of Curtis' hand and asked, "Debbie's alone on the dance floor. Aren't you worried?" "Nope," he replied. In fact, Curtis wasn't worried at all. When they walked in, everyone had seen Debbie with Carlos. That was enough to ensure that no one was going to mess with her, even if they didn't know who she was. Besides, all the guests at the party were good people. Debbie knew martial arts, too. She could take care of herself. So Curtis was going to let her do what she wanted and have fun. Hearing what Curtis said, Colleen didn't insist on going back to the dance floor and stayed at his side. Later, 2 women invited Debbie to go sailing. She wanted to go. She also thought she should tell Carlos about it in case he was worried. But he still hadn't come out of the room yet, so Debbie had to go alone. Fortunately, before she stepped on the boat, she saw Colleen and invited her along. So Curtis also knew where she was. Once the 2 girls were aboard, Curtis told the pilot, "It's late. Don't go far. A circuit around this area will do." "Yes, sir." There were quite a few people on the boat. Debbie didn't talk much with strangers, but because of her lively and outgoing personality, she fit in very soon. Musical instruments were available on the boat. Debbie took a guitar and played "Never Grow Old" for everyone. "I had a dream. Strange it may seem. It was my perfect day. Open my eyes. I realize this is my perfect day." When the song was over, everyone was enthusiastically clapping and made their enjoyment known. "Debbie, if you become a superstar, I'll go to your concert," said one of the people on the boat. "Why did you waste your talents going to economics and management school? You should have chosen a music school. You could be a pop star," another observed. But Debbie framed their comments as complimentary to Carlos. She thought they were trying to suck up to Carlos, rather than actually praising her performance. They'd been seen at the party together after all. After an hour, the boat came back and docked, but the party didn't end until after midnight. That was when Debbie finally caught sight of her husband. But he was not alone. Megan, who was at his side with a smile, was seeing the guests off with him. He handsome and she pretty. They looked like a couple. The sight of them being together upset Debbie, but she managed to check her emotions. She walked over to them and took Carlos' arm.
I'm tired.
I want to go home, she said. Carlos checked the time. It was already past midnight. But before he could say yes, Megan cut in with a smile. Uncle Carlos, I didn't come here in my car. I was going to crash here tonight, but everyone's taking off and I'm scared staying here alone. Can you give me a lift? Carlos wouldn't say no to such a small request. Debbie's heart sank when she heard Carlos say yes. She smiled wryly before sitting on the sofa and playing with her phone while waiting for them to say their farewells to the attendees. Finally, it was 1 a.m. and all the guests were gone. They boarded a boat and started their journey back. When Debbie finally saw Carlos Emperor parked close by, she was relieved and started walking towards the car. She took it for granted she should sit in the passenger seat. Before she could reach the car, however, Megan skipped to the car happily and opened the passenger side door. Aunt Debbie, come on. It's late, she shouted to Debbie. Debbie was surprised by what she was doing. Of course I know it's late, but what does she think she is doing? If she rides shotgun, where am I supposed to sit? I'm Carlos' wife. Shouldn't I sit next to my husband? While Debbie was pondering this, Carlos put his hand above Megan's head protectively when she got in the car. After Megan got in, Carlos closed the passenger side door and opened the back door for Debbie. Standing next to the door, he stretched out his right hand towards the door in a gesture of invitation as a sign of chivalry. A haven for bookworms and dreamers. Debbie was totally enraged. Her sleepiness had been banished. Why was Megan more important to him than his wife? She wanted to scream, "No, I don't want to get in your damn car." But looking around, she found Carlos' car was the only one available at that late hour. Ignoring him, Debbie opened the back door on the other side and got in. Only then did Carlos notice his wife's bad mood. He walked around the car, craned his head into the car and asked, "What's wrong?" Debbie closed her eyes and answered in a cold tone, "Nothing, just sleepy. Okay, we'll head home after we drop off Megan." After that, he closed the door and sat in the driver's seat. Debbie watched him start the car and sighed. He didn't understand her at all. The car sped down the road in the darkness. Sitting in the back, Debbie looked outside the window blankly, wide awake. The headlights of other cars knifed through the gloom. The girl in the passenger seat was giggling and speaking to Carlos. It bothered Debbie so much she wanted to plug her ears. Carlos didn't talk much and only responded when it was necessary. He didn't seem all that perturbed by the situation, but he never embarrassed Megan by allowing awkward silence. He made conversation quite pleasant for the girl. And the way she was carrying on, you could tell she enjoyed every minute. The car slowed down as it approached a large, fancy housing community. This must be where the girl lives, Debbie thought. There were tens of floors in each building. The skyscrapers made Debbie wonder whether Megan's apartment was a gift from Carlos. When the car came to a halt, Megan was ready to get out. "Wait up. It's dark and not safe for you to walk alone. I'll walk you to the door," Carlos offered. Debbie was fed up. "Son of a bitch, is she your wife or am I? Why do you care so much about her? Her building is right there, only a heartbeat away from the car. How dangerous can it be? And there are security guards patrolling the area. You jackass," she cursed inwardly. "Okay. Thank you, Uncle Carlos," Megan said gratefully. Carlos looked back at Debbie before exiting the car, only to find that she was in the back seat, back straight, eyes closed. Assuming that she was asleep, he got out without waking her up. In reality, she was as stiff as a board and mortified. Debbie waited in the car for 20 minutes, but there was no trace of her man. She was so furious she started laughing. "That bastard is probably sleeping with her. In the past, she would have exploded with rage by now. Yet in front of Carlos, she held her tongue. But staying in the car was impossible. She got out angrily and walked towards the entrance of the community. 10 minutes later, her phone rang. It was Carlos. Debbie gave a sneer and picked it up. "Mr. Huo, your lady get in all right? Where are you?" "I left, of course. Do you think I should have stayed until after you two had sex? Or gone upstairs and watched?" Debbie blurted out furiously. For a moment, the other end of the phone was silent. "Megan is a kid Wesley and I are fostering together. Don't overthink it." He finally spoke. "Ha, fostering. Mr. Huo, you are rich. I'm overthinking it. Mr. Huo, think about what you did. And ask yourself why I'm mad." Carlos ignored her sarcasm. "Where are you?" he asked again. He wanted to explain everything in person. "Don't bother looking for me. Bye." She hung up. Since it was a high-end community, it was in a remote location. At that hour, there were few cars on the road and a taxi was nowhere to be found. Debbie attempted to call a taxi through an app on her phone, but as soon as she unlocked her phone, Carlos called again. She hung up and logged into the app, but Carlos called again. He kept calling and interrupting her. She gave up trying to get a ride. Frustrated and angry, Debbie sat on the curb, glaring at the road. Then her phone buzzed. It was a message from Carlos. "Go ahead, refuse my next call. See what happens," he threatened. When he called again, Debbie thundered. "Mr. Huo, I never knew you had such thick skin to keep calling like that. When someone doesn't answer your call, it means they don't want to talk to you. Get it?" Carlos' patience ran out. His face darkened. Then a familiar figure by the roadside came into view. He hung up the phone without a word. Looking at her phone after Carlos had hung up, Debbie smiled wanly. "This is unbelievable. Is he angry at me now? How could he, after what he did?" she said to herself. Soon, a car drove over. Debbie stood up. The headlights were so glaring she had to turn her head away and close her eyes while walking backwards. When the car stopped behind her, she recognized that it was Carlos Emperor. He stepped out of the car, walked over to her, and pulled her into his arms fiercely. "Let go of me." She tried to wrench herself free, but it was of no avail. "Why are you doing this?" No woman he'd been with had dared to act so difficult, so determined to have her own way. On the other hand, he didn't understand what the woman was upset about. He thought she was just being unreasonable. "Why? You know why. How dare I, right?" Her sarcasm made Carlos think it was time for her to chill out. Silently, Carlos tucked Debbie into the car. Then he buckled her up and closed the door before striding to the driver's seat. But Debbie wasn't staying in the car obediently. She wanted to get out. Yet she had hardly unfastened the seat belt before Carlos got in and locked the doors. Neither of them said a word until 5 minutes later. "If you are angry because of Megan, don't be." Carlos finally broke the silence. Howsoever, Debbie didn't answer. Ignoring him, she closed her eyes and moved herself into a more comfortable position. She needed rest. Stealing a glance at her, Carlos frowned. "This woman is such a headache. What am I supposed to do with her?" he wondered. As soon as the car pulled into the garage at the villa, Debbie jumped out, hurried into her room, and quickly locked the door from inside. Eager to talk to her, Carlos followed her upstairs and pushed the door to her room, only to realize she had locked it from inside. For several minutes he stood there, knocking, but there was no response. Once more he forcefully tried to turn the knob, a futile attempt. Frustrated, he checked the time on his watch. It was past 3 a.m. already. I might as well let her rest now. Hopefully, she will be in the mood to talk when she wakes up tomorrow, he thought with resignation. Back to his bedroom, though, Carlos couldn't sleep on the matter. So he called Damon and told him what had happened after the party, hoping that he could help him figure out what had triggered Debbie's anger. But Carlos left out some details, which he thought didn't matter. For example, he didn't mention that he and Megan stayed in the same room for a long time, that Megan took the passenger seat, and that he helped her with some math problems after he had escorted her to her apartment. Therefore, Damon was also puzzled after hearing what Carlos had said. Did someone offend her on the island? Carlos shook his head. Obviously, it has something to do with Megan. I just don't know what it is. He still remembered what Debbie had shouted when he came out of Megan's apartment. Oh, then she must have misunderstood your relationship with Megan. She is jealous. I think you two will be fine after you explain everything to her. I did. I told her that Megan was a kid Wesley and I are fostering together. And then, Carlos took off his shirt and threw it into a basket. When we got home, she was still mad. She went straight into her room and locked herself inside. It amused Damon how a girl like Debbie would be a threat to any man. How she would give a player like him and Carlos the CO sleepless nights was something beyond Damon. Yet here they were, awake on the phone in the middle of the night analyzing why she was mad. The problem was, even he, the ladies' man, couldn't figure out what Debbie was angry about. So he started having wild guesses. Maybe she is just being unreasonable, or she is very possessive. Oh, or she is so possessive that she becomes unreasonable. Carlos really didn't know how to respond to that. Actually, good buddy, the simplest yet most effective solution is to do it, until she learns to forgive you. Damon was in fact speaking for himself. That was exactly what he had used on the woman he loved. And it had worked. She is still a girl, Carlos replied. It took Damon a long while to realize what he meant by that. And when he did, he jumped up from the bed and asked in disbelief, "Come on, Carlos. You want to tell me you and Debbie have never slept together?" Carlos suddenly felt embarrassed. "Carlos, man, what's the problem? Are you impotent? Between you and Debbie, could there be a medical problem? Or are you gay?" "Shut the fuck up," Carlos cursed. "I never force any woman. I want her to want to have sex with me." "Fine. Keep your cool then. Why are you freaking calling me in the middle of the night? 2 hot chicks are waiting for me in bed." Damon snarled. 2 women? Does Adriana know about this? The other end of the phone went silent, as if all of a sudden Damon's mind went blank. "Get out. Both of you." Carlos heard him shouting, apparently at a distance from the phone after a moment. Intrigued by what Damon was up to, Carlos looked out the window calmly, a cigarette in hand. He could hear the sound of door closing over the phone. "Where is she?" asked Damon. "Adriana showed up at the party, but when she saw you go into a hotel with another woman, she went back to New Zealand," Carlos answered. Hearing this, Damon stood up from the sofa in a fluster, grabbed his red suit jacket and said, "Bro, either you spoil your woman without a limit or you subjugate her in bed. Gotta go." With that, he hung up the phone. The next day, Debbie slept in. When she got up, it was already noon. Sitting in bed, she looked around her room, her head swimming. It took her a moment to remember that she had come home in the middle of the night. Unravel the unknown. Unleash the unimaginable. Memories of Carlos and Megan came flooding back. After freshening up, she came downstairs to have lunch. When the doorbell rang, it was Julie who answered. Tristan walked in with a couple of shopping bags. He walked over to Debbie and greeted, "Good afternoon, Mrs. Huo." Debbie nodded. "Afternoon to you, Mrs. Huo. Mr. Huo bought these and asked me to bring them to you." Debbie stopped eating and looked at those bags. Her eyes lit up on the sight of the logo of a designer lipstick brand she always wished for, but couldn't afford. At the price of a $6,000 per piece, it was way too expensive for her. "Thank Mr. Huo for me, but I won't take these. Take them back to him so that he can give them to someone else," Debbie said in a flat tone. Her refusal surprised Tristan. Had he walked into a marital storm? It was an awkward moment. He wished he should have excused himself. But Carlos was his boss, and he felt obliged to put in a good word for the big man. Mrs. Huo, Mr. Huo picked these for you in person this morning. I've worked for Mr. Huo for a long time, and I've never seen him pick a gift for any woman before. Scooping some rice from her plate, Debbie asked casually, "What about Megan's birthday gift?" Tristan was stunned. About that, Mr. Huo picked it himself. But what does this have to do with Miss Lawn? Tristan didn't understand why Debbie suddenly brought up Megan. But he had to do his job. Mrs. Huo, Mr. Huo was in an awful mood when he went to work this morning. But when he picked this gift for you, he was in an incredibly good mood. A good mood? How did you know? Did he smile? Or did he tell you that himself? Tristan was left speechless. He could tell that Debbie was furious about something. That made the situation even worse for him because although he was capable at work, he sucked when it came to women. The fact that he was a divorced man spoke for itself. Clutching at straws, he fumbled, "Well, as you know, Mr. Huo doesn't smile much, and he doesn't put his feelings into words." "I know," Debbie responded crisply. Once again, Tristan fell into silence. Careful not to make the situation spoil Tristan's mood over her differences with Carlos, she simply said, "Take these lipsticks back to Carlos Huo. I don't want them." However, unsure how he would face Carlos, Tristan put the lipsticks on the dining table and turned around. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Huo. I can't do that. If you don't want them, I guess you will have to take them back to Mr. Huo yourself. They are out of my hands now," he said anxiously as he headed for the door. Once he got out of the house, he wiped beads of sweat off his forehead and feeling the warmth of sunshine. A sudden need to talk to someone filled his heart. To help his boss, he might need Emmett to be around. Among his colleagues, Emmett was a friend to Debbie. Meeting Debbie in this foul mood reminded Tristan of his own struggle. "Emmett, come back home. I wouldn't be so miserable if you were here," he thought. Meanwhile, Emmett, who was on a construction site, supervising the crew, sneezed suddenly. "Damn, who is talking about me behind my back? Or is someone missing me?" he wondered. Actually, he had been thinking, "Mr. Huo, I miss you. I want to talk to you. Please take me back." Bowing his head, he pondered over it for a while. Then he took out his phone and called Tristan. "Tristan, how are things with Mr. and Mrs. Huo? Are they getting along?" When Tristan got Emmett's call, he had just returned to the office. Emmett's question caused him to think about the lipsticks Carlos had bought Debbie. In his opinion, a gift meant their relationship was okay. So he replied, "They're fine."
Okay.
"Thanks," Emmett said. After ending the call with Tristan, he called Debbie. Debbie didn't realize she hadn't talked to Emmett in a long time until she got his call. "Hi, Emmett," she said. She was about to go to Carlos' company to return the lipsticks when her phone rang. Who? How are you, Mrs. Huo?" Emmett cried over the phone, which made Debbie shiver. She thought something awful must have happened. "What's the matter?" she asked. The next moment, Emmett asked cautiously, "Mrs. Huo, is Mr. Huo with you?"
No.
"Why?" she wondered. Hearing that Carlos wasn't around, Emmett stopped crying and his voice went back to normal. "Mrs. Huo, I was sent away to carry bricks on a construction site because of you. I've been in this dull, terrible place for a month. You can't imagine what I've been through. When you pour yourself a drink and look out the window of your comfortable villa, do you ever think of me? Does it hurt when you do?" Debbie was surprised to hear that. Emmett, carrying bricks? Because of me? Why didn't Carlos tell me? I asked him about Emmett, but... "Sorry, I didn't know," she apologized. "Now you know. I want my old job back. You're Mr. Huo's wife. Can you help me out? If you bring me back, I'll do anything for you." "Anything?" Emmett pleaded. "Do anything for me? What about my husband?" Debbie asked. "Well, do anything for both of you." Debbie promised she'd put in a good word, but she couldn't promise that Carlos would forgive him. Swallowing the lump in his throat, he said that was fine. After ending the phone call, Debbie looked at the cartons of lipsticks, wondering what to do next. She had been thinking of returning the gift to Carlos. She intended to do so resolutely, so she would know that she couldn't be bought like that. She wasn't happy, but Emmett's phone call made her hesitate. She had to give it more thought before going to Carlos' company and talking to him. When Debbie visited ZL Group later, Carlos had just come back to his office after a meeting with a client. Just like last time, Rhonda received her at the reception desk. The difference was, this time Rhonda trotted over to her as soon as she saw her. "Nice to see you, Miss Nian. You're here to see Mr. Huo, right?" Without giving Debbie a chance to say anything, she added with a smile, "Mr. Huo has just returned to his office. I'll take you there right away." Rhonda's over-the-top enthusiasm made Debbie uncomfortable. She gave her a smile and said, "Okay, thanks." They walked down the lushly carpeted hall and entered the elevator. When they left the elevator on the 66th floor, Zelda, another of Carlos' secretaries, caught sight of Debbie. Although Debbie had been here before, for all kinds of reasons, this was the first time Zelda had seen her. She also didn't look happy to see her. She was definitely different from Rhonda. Colder, more distant. Debbie wasn't sure she liked her that much. It turned out Debbie's first impression was right. "Rhonda, who is this?" "Zelda, this is Miss Nian. Mr. Huo specifically said we should take her to his office whenever she drops by," Rhonda explained. Zelda hadn't paid much attention to Debbie until now. Hearing what Rhonda had said, she sized Debbie up and down and said indifferently, "Okay, I'll take it from here." Debbie smiled, "Thank you." Zelda, on the other hand, only gave her a sidelong glance before making her way to the CEO's office. Debbie pursed her lips at Zelda's back disapprovingly. What a rude bitch. So far, she had met 3 of Carlos' secretaries, the other 2 being Rhonda and Tristan. Of all of them, Zelda was the most arrogant. When they came to the door of Carlos' office, Zelda knocked and soon Carlos responded, "Come in, where stories blossom." With the CEO's permission, Zelda pushed the door open quietly and said respectfully, "Mr. Huo, there's a Miss Nian here to see you." Debbie took one step forward and saw what was going on in the office. Instead of sitting at his desk, Carlos was reading a file while relaxing on the sofa. Megan was at his desk. She was doing her homework. "Ah, it's Debbie."
Y Davia.
"Come on in." Megan put down her pen and came to the door when she spotted Debbie standing there. "Debbie? Ha! What happened to Aunt Debbie? Is it because the secretary is here and she doesn't want her to know about my relationship with Carlos?" Debbie didn't like to think badly of Megan, but from what she had learned about that girl, that was most likely the case. Megan's words drew Carlos' attention away from his work. He dropped the file and scolded, "Don't be disrespectful." Megan intimately held Debbie's arm and said, "Uncle Carlos, Debbie and I are almost the same age. Calling her aunt makes her sound much older. I think sister is fine. Right, Debbie?" Megan turned to look at Debbie expectantly for a response. She sounded friendly and acted nice, but somehow, Debbie couldn't manage a smile, as much as she tried. Yes, Megan hadn't done anything to harm her directly, but there was this hostility in Debbie's heart growing minute by minute when she saw that younger girl, especially when she saw her with Carlos. Debbie finally forced a wry smile and nodded at her. Carlos didn't say anything else. He stood up from the sofa and said to Debbie, "Come in." Debbie bit her lower lip while thinking about it. Megan's books and papers were spread out on Carlos' desk. There were science papers, math papers, and a pile of hardback textbooks, all signs that the girl was in school. The sight of it caused a strong sense of revulsion in Debbie's heart. She decided not to go inside. She turned to Megan and handed her the bags she had been holding all the while.
No.
"I just came here to give these back." "Bye." she said to Carlos. It was quick and decisive, just not quite the way she had envisioned it. But then again, she hadn't imagined she'd run into Megan here. Who knew what Carlos did with Megan when Debbie wasn't around? Debbie. Megan called behind her. She had no idea what she did, or why Debbie was acting this way. But Debbie didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She certainly wasn't going to stay there a minute longer and continue to be humiliated. Each stride was purposeful, and as long as she could comfortably make them. There was no way to make this any better, and then, "Stop!" Carlos called out coldly, causing Zelda to gasp. Who is this woman? She wondered. And what does Mr. Huo have to do with her? Zelda knew something was up now. The visitor was clearly furious. But why? Does she think Mr. Huo owes her something? She decided to wait and watch. Debbie paused. She turned around and asked in a sarcastic tone, "Yes, Mr. Huo? I'm rushing off to school. Is there a problem?" At this point, Megan had already ripped open one box of lipsticks. The smile on her face said everything. She was ecstatic, practically glowing. Somehow made Debbie feel even worse. As if she didn't notice what was going on at all. She exclaimed, "Wow! These colors are fantastic. I don't have any of these. Uncle Carlos, did you ask Debbie to buy these for me?" Debbie and Carlos were stunned. I said giving back the lipsticks, not bring them. What is she? Mentally challenged? Why does she think the lipsticks are for her? Debbie looked at Carlos and sneered. "Yes, your Uncle Carlos bought these for you. They're limited editions. Enjoy." That made Megan even happier. She put the lipstick back into the bags and hopped to Carlos' side like a rabbit. "Thank you, Uncle Carlos. I love them." Then, right under Debbie's nose, she stood on tiptoe and kissed Carlos on the cheek, just as she had kissed Curtis on her birthday. Watching this, Zelda retreated to her seat. "I'm right. It seems Miss Lan is going to be Mrs. Huo. Mr. Huo is 10 years older, but I guess it doesn't matter as long as they love each other. But who is this stupid woman at the door? Mr. Huo and Miss Lan are having a moment there, and she is still hanging around, being the third wheel. So annoying," she thought resentfully. For a second, she wanted to grab Debbie and drag her out of the office. Debbie looked at Megan in shock. How could she? She has kissed Curtis right in front of Colleen the other night, and just now she has kissed Carlos right in front of Debbie. Suddenly, it dawned on Debbie what Colleen had meant by watch out for Megan. At the same time, Megan seemed to have realized that she messed up.
I'm sorry, Debbie.
Habits. But now that you are my auntie, I'll work on it. Habits. Debbie couldn't help wondering, how many times has she kissed him? And does she kiss him like I do? To ease the tension, Debbie took a deep breath and said, "You might be more open-minded since you grew up in Norway." Then with a delicate smile, she added, "But I'm conservative, and you can't behave like this again, Megan, or else I may misunderstand you." In response, Megan nodded and excused herself, saying it would be better if she left, so that Carlos and Debbie could have some personal time alone. That's a good idea, considering your Uncle Carlos is a married man. It's inappropriate for you two to be alone. Debbie cut in ahead of Carlos. Then she winked at him and added, "Honey, I'll go back to school later. The driver can pick up Megan when he drives me to school." However, Carlos didn't answer her back. Looking at Megan, who was putting away her homework, he said, "Megan, I'll ask the driver to drop you home now. Who am I supposed to respond to between the two of you?" asked Megan, unimpressed by conflicting instructions. Carlos shot Debbie a warning look and walked to the door, where he instructed, "Zelda, tell the driver to drop Megan home." "Yes, Mr. Huo." On the spot, Zelda called the driver. After Megan had left the office, Debbie turned around and was ready to leave too, when Carlos grabbed her hand. "Come in," he said.
No.
"I'm not staying," she replied stubbornly. which came as a shock to the secretaries who had been observing what was going on in the CEO's office. Lord, did she just say no to Mr. Huo? Anticipating their boss would explode with rage, they all pretended to bury their heads in work. Everyone was afraid that they would be the victim of their boss' impending fury. I said, "Come in," Carlos continued in a colder tone, still holding Debbie's hand. The expression on his face indicated that his demand was non-negotiable. However, Debbie shook his hand off and shouted, "I already said no." She cast the man a glare and turned around. But the next thing she knew, her feet were off the floor, Carlos holding her by the waist and carrying her into his office. "Carlos Huo, put me down. You sleazebag. I'll kill you. I'll—" The woman's voice trailed off when the door was shut. The secretaries exchanged terrified and confused looks and lowered their heads again. In his office, Carlos put Debbie down on the sofa. She tried to get up, but was stopped every time by Carlos. After some exchanges of moves between martial arts masters, she was overwhelmed and confined to the sofa, Carlos' body closely against hers. Humiliated and angry, she wanted to curse, but as soon as she opened her mouth, a pair of wet lips pressed down. The man was fierce, yet the scent on his body was so enchanting for a moment, Debbie almost forgot to fight. For a while, Carlos kept on holding her. "Debbie Nian, you have been unreasonable. Don't push my buttons," he said, breathing heavily. When he finally relaxed, Debbie took a deep breath, looked him in the eye and asked sarcastically, "Your buttons? Do you mean Megan?" The gloom on Carlos' face deepened. His hands gripping her wrists tightened. "I don't like repeating my words. For the last time, Megan is a girl Wesley and I are fostering together. Don't pick on her," he snarled. "Pick on her." Debbie hit the ceiling. She tried to kick the man off her, but after some wriggling, she was forced to give up. "You asshole. I never." The rest of her words caught in her throat when the fierce lips came again. Several minutes later, Debbie gasped greedily for air, feeling as if her lungs had been sucked empty. A moment more and she might suffocate from the kiss. By now, she didn't think it necessary for them to talk about what had been going on between them recently. "I have to go back to school. Let me go," she said. Carlos didn't move. "Are you done with the drama?" "Drama? Drama your ass," she cursed in her heart. "Yes, I'm done. They were just a nominal couple after all. She shouldn't take everything seriously. At least that offered her some consolation." "You're upset," Carlos declared. "No, I'm not. You're reading too much into it," Debbie denied. Even so, Carlos knew he was right. He eventually released her, but didn't allow her to go. He made her sit on his lap and wrapped his right arm around her waist. Annoyed, Debbie rolled her eyes. "What now?" To which Carlos asked, "Why did you give the lipsticks back?" "Why should I keep them?" she retorted curtly. "They were a gift for you, and it pissed me off that you didn't appreciate my effort." "That's insulting." Debbie sneered. "Huh, was it a must that I accept them? Get over yourself. I can say no to anyone. Okay?" Nonetheless, she actually started regretting giving those lipsticks away. She really loved the brand and colors, not to mention that now Megan had them. The idea made her wish she could collect them back. But then she recalled Megan kissing Carlos and how calm Carlos had been. The kiss must have happened a lot of times and he must have become accustomed to it. Ignoring her hostile tone, Carlos ordered, "You have no right to throw away gifts that have cost me an arm and a leg. That depends." Debbie finally got a chance to negotiate with Carlos, who was trying to read what was going on in her mind. All of a sudden, Debbie wasn't angry anymore. She locked her arms around his neck and observed, "I have 3 terms. Debbie might have forgotten that Carlos was a successful businessman. How was it possible for him to agree to trade 1 term for 3 terms? "No problem. But to be fair, you have to agree with my 3 terms too," Carlos said firmly. 3 for 3, it sounded fair. But why did she feel she had missed something? and she didn't know exactly what was wrong. To make Carlos agree with her terms quickly, she nodded, "Fire away. Discover your next adventure at Sigma Nu Epsilon Iota Eta. Ladies first." Debbie had to begin. "First, you have to call Megan and get the lipsticks back. But I won't take the broken ones." In disapproval, Carlos' mouth twitched. "You already told her those lipsticks were a gift. How do you expect me to ask them back? I can buy you new ones." "No, I only want those." She wouldn't let Megan benefit from their argument. Carlos was lost for words. Noticing his silence, Debbie stood up and declared, "I see no point continuing this talk." For the first time in his life, Carlos felt so helpless. "Okay, your next term." Debbie Nian, "Good for you," he thought. "You can't stay with her alone for more than 5 minutes. No, 5 minutes is too long. What if you are not so good in bed? 1 minute. You can't stay with her alone for more than 1 minute," Debbie said, holding up her index finger. Even though she saw clearly that Carlos' face had turned black, he didn't think it was funny at all. "This woman, how could you humiliate me like this? Underestimating my ability in bed? I'll let you know how good I am at that, woman, right now." He pulled her hard towards him and held her tightly. "Hey, what are you doing? You haven't said yes to my second term yet. Where are you taking me?" she asked nervously. But Carlos didn't respond. Off he carried her towards the lounge. What was he going to do? "I agree to your first 2 conditions. As for the third, keep it to yourself. Now it's my turn." "This is my first condition," said Carlos as he kicked open the door of the lounge, entered the room with Debbie in his arms and locked the door behind them. He passed all the other furniture in the room adroitly. They zipped past tables, chairs, and a standing liquor cabinet before Carlos stopped at the bed. The richly appointed bed was inspired by 18th century designs and featured round ball-top bedposts. It was colored a beautiful black walnut. An ornate juvees covered the sheets. "What condition is that?" Debbie asked. Looking at the king-sized bed adorned with gray sheets, Debbie had a bad feeling all of a sudden. She was not sure what was going on, but the bed put an image in her head, and she was going to try and forestall that as long as she could. "I'll have to show you for how many minutes you should forbid me from being alone with Megan." As he said this, he threw Debbie onto the bed. In an instant, he was on top of her. Her heart rate skyrocketed. Before she could respond, the man moved her arms up and held her hands above her head with his own hand. She struggled, but was unable to move. Wait, I'm trying to discuss something with you." "I'm not here for this," she yelled, panicked. "We can discuss it while we do this." He pulled the zipper of her jacket down, peeled it off and threw it onto the floor. It lay there, silent witness to the actions Carlos was taking. "What's going on?" she mused, growing more panicky. And that was the thing. She was hoping he'd say something to ease her anxiety. Instead, his actions just scared her even more. Suddenly, he stopped, leaned forward and looked into her eyes. He said in a serious voice, "Deb, I've already given you plenty of time. We've been married for 3 years, and I never laid a finger on you. I don't care about the past, but from now on, I want you to be my woman, physically and mentally. Understand?" She didn't think Carlos had it in him. He never so many words at a time. This was the most he'd said to her in a while. Debbie, however, was focused on the sentence. "I want you to be my woman, physically and mentally. He's going to have sex with me? What should I do? Should I turn him down?" With a red face, she stammered, I understand." To be honest, she had already mentally prepared for this when they were in J-City. After all, Carlos was her husband, and it was normal for couples to have sex. They would have done it there if it weren't for their argument. They couldn't agree on what position to use. But now she wasn't so sure. She wanted to talk to him, not do the horizontal mambo. And so far, Carlos had been nice to her. The only thing he did that really ticked her off was maintain a relationship with Megan. And even that could be forgiven, as long as none of them crossed the line. Problem was, she wasn't sure that they hadn't crossed that fabled line. He generally treated her well. He made sure she was well taken care of financially, and sent Philip and Julie to ensure she was okay. All right, Fine, I can do this. He's my husband. Debbie consoled herself internally. But what Carlos said next sent chills down her spine. Don't be so nervous. This isn't your first time. I don't care whether you were top or bottom. But me, I have to be... Smack! Carlos failed to finish his sentence. The sound of a slap echoed through the lounge. After that, time seemed to stop. There were no other sounds in the room. None at all. And she lay there, watching his expression turn, and the moments seemed like millennia. She waited nanosecond by agonizing nanosecond as the full impact of what she'd done sank in. Carlos' face soured as he watched the girl turn from shy to angry. He hadn't bargained for this. Not at all. She was his wife. Damn it, she was his woman, and she had no right to turn him down. Not now. Not like this. Not after all he'd done for her. And now, she dared to lay her hand on him. She slapped me. Again? He couldn't hold back his anger anymore. It rose in him, threatening to explode. He balled a fist, ready to repay her actions with interest. When Debbie heard him say, "This isn't your first time," she finally got it. And that was not all. She now knew why he said, "I don't care about the past." He didn't think she was a virgin. That was when she remembered. Before he knew she was his wife, he had always believed she was a slut who dated countless boys. Ha ha ha. God, was I stupid? She laughed, but tears streamed down her cheeks. These were not tears of joy. A rush of adrenaline overtook her as she pushed the man away from her, jumped out of bed and shouted, "You asshole!" That word hung in the air between them longer than either of them would like to admit. Each person believed they had been wronged, and that might change things between them. After that, she grabbed her jacket and stormed out of his office, crying. She opened the office door and was about to leave when suddenly she saw Tristan standing there. He had his hand raised, poised to knock. Seeing Debbie in tears, he was stunned and blurted out, "Mrs. Huo." Debbie was in no mood to talk to anyone. She bit her lips and ran towards the lift without saying a word. She just couldn't right now. Staring at her retreating figure, Tristan wondered, why the tears? Did she have a fight with Mr. Huo? He turned his head, his gaze shifting to the office, only to see his boss come out of the lounge with a stony face. Carlos cast a cold glance at Tristan before he sat on the couch and lit a cigarette. Now that Carlos had already seen him, Tristan couldn't just shut the door and leave. He swallowed hard and entered the office. He presented a file folder to Carlos and said, "Boss, I got this from our branch office, and there's an urgent." Before he could finish his sentence, Carlos interrupted him impatiently. "I asked you to investigate my wife. Do you know anything about her previous relationships? Who was she with? And for how long?" "No," Tristan answered briefly, his head lowered. He knew he'd failed Carlos, and was ready to accept punishment if necessary. Carlos hadn't asked him to investigate Debbie's relationships with other boys. He didn't dare to do it without authorization, and this was what he was waiting for. "Leave the file here and do what I told you to do," he demanded coldly. "Yes, Mr. Huo. Pay special attention to her relationship with Hayden Gu." "Yes, Mr. Huo." Tristan raised his head and was on the point of leaving when he saw Carlos' face. A red mark? After a closer look, Tristan confirmed that Carlos did have a red mark on his cheek, about hand-sized. His mouth widened in shock. Did Mrs. Huo slap him? "Out!" Carlos thundered. Frightened, Tristan ran out of Carlos' office and went back to his seat. He took a moment to slow his breathing and patted his chest to calm himself down. Oh my gosh, this is the first time Mr. Huo has been this angry. Last time he blew his top when we lost an order worth 100 million, but he was not this angry. But now, women will humble the mightiest of heroes. He mused. Now he finally understood why Carlos had exiled Emmett to the construction site. Emmett probably sided with Debbie. Even so, Tristan considered it a smart move for Emmett to build a close relationship with Debbie, in light of how much she could influence Carlos, so he decided to do the same. Leaving the ZL group, Debbie hailed a taxi and proceeded to the university. But she changed her mind halfway and told the driver, "On second thought, take me to Shining International Plaza." Then she took out her phone, opened the WeChat app and mentioned Casey and Christina in their group chat. "I'll be waiting at our old haunt. You guys coming? Playing hooky again, tomboy?" Dixon asked curiously. "Yeah, I'm not in the mood. I need to blow off steam." While waiting for Casey's and Christina's replies, Debbie posted an update in moments. "I want." She couldn't finish it. She was too mad, so she just left it that way. She couldn't wait to get together with her friends. Instantly, someone going by the handle C commented, "What so you want?" Initially, Debbie didn't play to reply, for she didn't know who this person was. But she was really frustrated right now and wanted to vent her anger. So she replied, "I want Carlos Huo to step barefoot on a porcupine." She didn't think it was a big deal to mention Carlos Huo in moments. Only her close friends knew she was married to him. As for the rest of her WeChat friends, they all thought that she was cracking a joke. C replied, "What did he do to you?" Debbie paused. She wasn't stupid enough to tell a stranger the whole story between her and Carlos. She just said, "He didn't do anything to me. He thought his girlfriend has slept with her ex." "I just can't believe he said that." Debbie updated her moments a couple of times, but C stopped posting. Maybe he's busy right now, she thought. She really wanted to find out who this person with no profile photo was. Having no profile pic was rare, but not impossible. All he needed to do was upload a blank PNG file and it wouldn't show up on WeChat. She clicked his dialog box and sent a message, "May I ask who you are?" C replied very quickly, "You don't need to know who I am." The reply rendered Debbie speechless. Shaking it off, she decided to ignore him. Probably just some rando on the internet, she thought. However, within 2 minutes, C changed the profile photo. The new one seemed somewhat familiar, but it was a bit small to see on the phone. Debbie tapped on it to see in full screen mode. That person used her photo as profile pic. She and Casey had vacationed in Paris together and Casey took a picture of her standing beneath the Eiffel Tower. She posted that picture in moments. Debbie tapped the photo to make it normal-sized again and sent a message to C. "Why did you use my pic as your profile photo? Who the heck are you? You know me?" C's response floored her. "You know how people put beautiful singers and actresses in their profile pics? You look hot in that pic, so I used it. I like you and I'm going to make you mine." Debbie rolled her eyes at her phone screen where the nickname C flashed on it. She typed a message. "I'm a married woman. If you crack such jokes again, I'll definitely blacklist you." The guy, C, replied to her, "I want to be friends with you." She felt bored after chatting with him, so she locked her phone and put it back into her pocket. Debbie bent over the table and sipped her milk tea through a straw. A moment later, Casey and Christina walked into their old haunt, number 99 Milk Tea. Debbie waved her hand to them lazily and called out, "Hey, I'm here." Casey sat down next to her and asked curiously, "I thought you weren't going to play truant again. Why did you bunk off school today?" A few days ago, Debbie had told them that she wouldn't dare skip school again because Carlos would punish her if she did. They weren't expecting Debbie to go back on her word so soon. Christina was more considerate than Casey. The moment she saw Debbie, she realized that something was wrong. "Debbie, were you crying?" she asked in a voice full of concern. It was not until then that Casey noticed that Debbie's eyes were red and swollen. Debbie ordered 2 cups of milk tea for her friends before she cursed through gritted teeth. Carlos Huo is such a jerk. Casey immediately covered Debbie's mouth with her hand. Shoo, look, I know that Carlos Huo is your husband, but keep those kinds of words to yourself. Do not curse him in public. If his fans hear you, you're definitely screwed. Debbie did not care for her warning. She shoved Casey's hand away and snapped back. I'm cursing my own husband. What does it have to do with them? Christina approached her and whispered in her ear. They don't know that Carlos Huo is your husband. A girl cursed him at an airport because she had failed to attract his attention. And that caught the attention of his fans. The girl ended up being beaten up and taken to the hospital. Debbie's jaw dropped at Christina's surprising words. She gulped hard and exclaimed in a low voice, That's crazy. If they found out that I'm married to him, would they go insane and cut me into pieces? Casey nodded and feigned a serious tone. They would. So you better watch your language. And she couldn't hold it anymore and burst into a fit of laughter. Christina tapped Casey's arm, gesturing for her to not tease Debbie again. Tomboy, tell us why you are in such a bad mood. Who was terrible enough to make you cry? We'll teach them not to mess with our friend. They had known Debbie for years, and they had only seen her cry once after her father had passed away. This was the second time they had seen her cry, where every word sparks wonder. Oh, forget it. You possibly couldn't teach Carlos Huo anything. I've cried so many times because of him now. That bastard. Although she hated to admit it, Debbie had been in tears several times since Carlos had moved back into the villa. Christina and Casey shared a knowing look. Casey asked, sighing, Did you piss him off again? Hey, he's the one who's making me cry again and again. Why won't you blame him for his behavior? He's such a jerk. A good man would never make his girl cry. Debbie was puzzled by their lack of support. Christina and Casey despised men who made girls cry. But why weren't they taking her side this time? The 2 girls shook their heads and said in unison, I don't dare. Even if his crazy fans were not around, they wouldn't dare curse Carlos Huo in Y City. After all, this was his domain. Debbie stared at her friends, mouth agape. I asked you to come here to console me, but instead, you have managed to make me more upset. She waved her hand and dismissed them. You guys should leave. I don't want to see you right now. She'd rather stay alone than be with people who didn't understand her. The waitress came with their milk tea at that moment. Casey put her cup aside and held Debbie's hand in hers. We were just joking with you. Don't be mad. Tell us, what happened between you and him? After a pause, Debbie said in an angry tone, Do you still remember how Carlos and I had a fight in J City regarding who would be on top? I thought about it and decided to give in to him. So I went to his office today, and just when? She was too embarrassed to continue. She blushed scarlet. Although she was used to discussing these things with her friends, it felt totally different when it came to her own life. She didn't know how to continue. Seeing their excited eyes, she covered her face with her hands and stammered, When we were about to begin, he, thought I was not a virgin. She peeked at them through the gap between her fingers. They were looking at her eagerly. She continued, He said that since it was not my first time, I shouldn't be too nervous. And he also went on to say that he didn't care whether I or my ex was on top before. I was so pissed off. She dropped her hands and banged the table in frustration. He's such an ass. How could he think of me like that? He had even called me a slut once before he knew that I'm his wife. Christina and Casey were startled by the rattling of the table and tried to console her. Easy, Debbie, relax. There were not many guests in the shop, but the employees were attracted by the loud sound. They all turned to stare at them, frowning. Realizing what she had done, Debbie gave them an apologetic smile and then lowered her head to take a sip of her drink. Casey chuckled. So, you failed to get laid again? This is hilarious. Debbie nodded while pouting. How could she have sex with him after being insulted like that? Casey sighed with profound resignation and said, "If I were you, I would have gone on with it and proved to him that I was a virgin. It would have been a tight slap in his face, and then you should have forced him to kneel before you and apologize." "Kneel before me and apologize? He would never do that." Debbie shook her head, knowing Carlos very well. "It's Carlos Huo, the great Mr. President. He seldom apologizes, let alone kneel before me." Debbie mused. "Come on, tomboy, why are you being so naive? It should be a run in the park for you to make him do such a small thing as kneeling." Casey flashes a sly smile and winked at Debbie. Christina got her meaning instantly and giggled. Seeing Debbie's confused expression, she approached her and whispered in her ear, "Well, if you have sex with him in a regular position, then he will be kneeling before you. So," her voice was very low, but Debbie heard her every word clearly, and her face instantly turned bright red. "Christina, I thought you were an innocent girl. This is all because of Casey. She is such a bad influence on you." Casey felt wronged and retorted, "Hey tomboy, this has nothing to do with me. I'm single, but Christina has a boyfriend. She knows much more than I do. And although you know very little about all this right now, I'm sure that you'll be sophisticated enough once you become Carlos' woman. After all, your husband looks like he's experienced." Annoyed, Debbie pinched her arm, and they began to fight in jest. Christina, however, did not agree with Casey. "I don't think that Mr. Huo is an experienced man in this matter. My guess is that he's still a virgin. Otherwise, why would he always piss Debbie off like this? He knows next to nothing about women, and he is emotionally unavailable. He has also failed to sleep without Debbie even after such a long time." After some consideration, Casey nodded. "That makes perfect sense. Debbie, you are so lucky." Debbie was dumbfounded.
I'm lucky.
"How?" Casey and Christina said nothing more, but winked at her with a cunning smile. Unable to bear them anymore, Debbie pouted and asked in fury, "Are you here to console me or to make fun of me?" Casey tried hard to hold back her laughter and said, "Easy, Deb, just listen to me. Fuck him once and slap him in the face with the truth that you're a virgin." Debbie was speechless. She had originally hoped that Casey and Christina would console her and give her some advice. But all they did was support Carlos and even ask her to sleep with him. "I must have been blind when I made friends with you too. You betrayed me and changed sides." Debbie rolled her eyes. "Immerse yourself in the Storyverse." Christina grabbed Debbie's hand and put it on her chest. "Tomboy, trust me. I was always your best friend. But that was before I knew that Carlos Huo is your husband. Now that I know the truth, I'm siding with him." Debbie retrieved her hand and hit her playfully. "Ouch! Hey, don't hit me. I'm just telling the truth." The three of them made fun of each other and burst into laughter. Debbie felt more cheerful now after talking to them. Christina told some dirty joke again, and Debbie instantly blushed scarlet and hit her arm. Christina caught Debbie's hand and said, "Come on, tomboy. Don't act like a kid. You are his wife, and it's perfectly normal for a couple to get laid." Debbie covered Christina's mouth with her hands to stop her from saying anything more, and Christina started tickling her in return. Debbie laughed out loud, unable to tolerate the tickling torture. She waved her arms to stop Christina. Casey immediately held Debbie's arms and said, "Stop, you too. Tomboy, to be honest, you should feel lucky to have a husband like Carlos Huo. If he were not your husband, we wouldn't have gotten the VIP cards for the 5th floor of the Alioth building. Why do you think he gave us the cards?" Casey raised her brows at Debbie and continued after a pause. "It's as the saying goes, love me, love my dog. He wanted to treat your friends well because he cares about you. I wish you would look before you leap anymore. There must be some kind of misunderstanding between you and him. Why don't you two just sit down and talk?" Christina echoed, "Exactly. And that day, when we were having lunch on the 5th floor of the Alioth building, he joined us. You two started showing off your affection for each other before us. We were so jealous of you. I still remember the way he looked at you. His eyes were full of affection. If it weren't for my dear Dixon, I would have already fallen for Mr. Huo. Debbie rolled her eyes at her friends and snapped back. I can't believe that you both are smitten by him, and here I thought that I could count on you to bring him down. Oh, my heart is broken. Casey and Christina are so mean. Ever since they found out that Carlos is my husband, they seem to have forgotten what he had done to me in the past. Debbie mused. Since that time when Carlos had gone to J City to rescue her, Debbie had been so touched and had forgotten the terrible things he had done to her in the past. But now the memories came flooding back to her. He had his men throw me into the ocean, and he even threatened to bury me alive. The jerk! She cursed inwardly. Deb, trust me. He is a good man, and you need to cherish him. I think you should be nicer to him. And tell me the truth. Did you hit him this time? I really hope you didn't. Before Casey could finish her sentence, she was interrupted enthusiastically by Debbie. She gave her a proud smile and said, I did. I slapped him right across the face. What? Both Casey and Christina blurted in unison, stunned by her confession. Christina choked on the red beans in the milk tea and coughed violently. After she stopped coughing, she asked in disbelief, Are you kidding me? Tomboy, did you really slap him? Debbie nodded nonchalantly and thought to herself, How dare he think so low of me? I let him off easy by only slapping him once. Casey covered her face with both hands. She knew that Debbie was a short-tempered girl, but she never expected that she would slap her husband across the face. Tomboy, why are you always so impulsive? Who do you think Carlos Huo is? He's the richest man in Y City. No, the richest man in the world. How could you lay your hands on him? Debbie sat upright and told them with a straight face, This is not the first time I've hit him. It happened once when Jared took me to a wine party. I almost turned him into a eunuch by kicking him in the crotch. She could still remember how hard she had kicked him that day. Casey and Christina stared at Debbie, mouth agape. Words had left them. Finally, Casey found her voice. She patted Debbie on the shoulder and said, Tomboy, he hasn't killed you after what you have done. He must love you very much. You must be nicer to him. Okay? Christina patted her other shoulder and echoed, Casey's right. Go back home and apologize to him. He will forgive you. Debbie couldn't believe her ears. She shook her head at her two friends. She didn't want to go home then, and she didn't want to go home that evening either. Dixon called Christina a while later, and she bid goodbye to her friends and left soon after. Casey and Debbie stayed there until 9 p.m. They hailed a taxi and went to the university. When they got out of the taxi, many students were swarming into the university. The university gates closed at 10 p.m. At the entrance of the girls' dorm, many couples were hugging and kissing, unwilling to say their goodbyes for the night. I'm a big girl, in a big world. It's not a big thing if you leave me. Debbie was about to enter the dorm when her phone started ringing loudly. She took it out from her pocket and was surprised to see the name on the screen. Casey turned to her and asked with a frown, Who is it? Why are you not answering? After some hesitation, Debbie dismissed the call instead of answering it. She held Casey's arm and said, Nobody, let's go. However, her phone kept ringing again and again, no matter how many times Debbie dismissed it. Casey was unable to bear it any longer and pleaded, Tomboy, just answer it. Okay? I'll lose my hearing if you don't. Before Debbie could answer it, the ringtone stopped, and a text message popped up on her phone. Upon seeing the text, Debbie gnashed her teeth and grabbed her phone tighter. The text said, I'm waiting for you at the school gates. If you don't show up in 5 minutes, I'll come to your dorm and drag you out. Debbie gave her stuff to Casey and said, I have something urgent to deal with. Taking over Debbie's stuff, Casey looked at her with a puzzled and worried expression. She grabbed Debbie's wrist and asked, Tomboy, who is it? You look like you are gathering up for a fight. Do you want me to come with you? It's Carlos Huo. Are you sure you want to come with me? Debbie teased her. Instantly, Casey shook her head. Oh no. No. You better get going. Don't make him wait for you. Clear your misunderstandings and start being a proper couple. I'm leaving now. Casey dashed into the dorm as if she was being chased by some dangerous beast. Debbie sighed and turned around towards the school gates. She ran at her highest speed. Otherwise, she wouldn't be able to make it there within 5 minutes. When she arrived, she saw a familiar Emperor car. Many students' attention was drawn to the luxurious car. Some girls were trying hard to figure out who was inside the car. Debbie gasped for air as she pulled up her hoodie and covered her face. She didn't want the students to gossip about her later on. She walked to the other side of the car and got into the back seat. Carlos was in the driver's seat. He had spotted Debbie the moment she had arrived at the gates. After she was safely in the car, he started the engine and drove away from the university gates. He said nothing as he drove towards the East City villa. Debbie couldn't bear the silence anymore and said, Mr. Huo, just tell me what you want right here. I'm not staying at the villa this evening. I'll take a taxi back to school. Debbie was a straightforward girl. She didn't and wouldn't hide her true feelings in front of anyone. This was both her virtue and her flaw. She just wouldn't pretend to be polite and compliant. Carlos could tell from her long face and her words that she was still angry at him. You don't need to take a taxi anymore. I'll buy you a car, Carlos said in a calm voice. What the fuck? I wasn't implying that I want a car. Okay? Debbie fumed with rage. Thank you, Mr. Huo, but I don't need a car. On second thought, Debbie knew that it was of no use arguing with him. She sighed and said, Never mind. Just stop the car and let me go back. I already told you that you're not allowed to live in the dorm again, he said coldly. Yes, you did. But why do I have to follow your orders? Who do you think you are? You also want me to quit learning martial arts and take yoga and dancing lessons. But why do I have to listen to you? She yelled. Because you are Mrs. Huo, he said calmly. Mrs. Huo? Haha, women are lining up to be the next Mrs. Huo. How about we get a divorce and I give someone else the privilege? Debbie taunted. The car screeched to a halt with a piercing sound, which startled the girl in the back seat. She swallowed and stroked her chest to calm herself down. I'm such a fool. Why did I have to piss off the guy behind the wheel? Car crash victim isn't a good look for you, Debbie, she told herself. Carlos parked the car along the roadside. A few seconds later, he unfastened his seatbelt, grabbed several bags in the passenger seat and left the car. Then he pulled open the back door and got in. Instantly, Debbie scooted over to the next seat to stay away from him. She was frightened. What was he going to do? Without saying a word, he set the bags in her lap. She looked down and saw the shades of lipstick he had bought for her earlier. Even the carton of lipsticks whose packaging had been opened by Megan was in one of the bags. Did he buy me a new set? Or did he take the old set back from Megan as I said? She mused. As if Carlos could read her mind, he explained, I got those lipsticks back from Megan except the carton she already opened. To replace it, I simply went to the mall and bought the same one again. A myriad of thoughts flooded Debbie's mind. Words left her as she stared at the bags. She didn't know whether she should just give in and forgive him, or persist in ignoring his gestures. After all, she was still mad at him because he said she wasn't a virgin. How could he? Carlos suddenly moved like a pouncing cat and ended up hovering above her. His face was so close to hers that she could feel his warm breath against her cheek. Looking her in the eye, he said sincerely, I'm really sorry. I had no call to say that. What he said was disrespectful. No wonder she was mad at him. He came back home with the lipsticks early this evening, but Julie was the only one there to welcome him. Julie told him Debbie moved into her dorm. Somehow, he was suddenly struck with a deep sense of loss. He never knew what he had until it was gone. When he finally regained his composure again, he was already at the gates of her university. He called her more than 10 times, but she rejected all of them. He had no other choice but to threaten her. She had even pulled her hood up before getting into his car. Is it embarrassing to be with me? Why doesn't she want people to know that I'm her ride? He wondered. Thinking about this, he removed her hood and was much more satisfied when he saw her girlish bun. He reached out his hand to smooth some stray hair. Debbie wasn't sure how she felt, but his sincere apology left her in a trance. He apologized to me? A proud man like him would apologize? She was too shocked to utter a single word. Carlos was amused by her reaction. It wasn't every day that he managed to shock her, but not for lack of trying. He kissed her softly on the forehead and whispered in her ear, "I don't want to fight anymore. Let's go home." Fight? Does wanting a divorce count as fighting? She thought inwardly. When they reached the villa, Carlos got out of the car and opened the back door. He took the bags and helped Debbie out of the car. He was so considerate and careful that Debbie felt like she was a pregnant woman. Inside Debbie's bedroom, Carlos pulled the wrappings off a box of lipsticks and put the lipsticks on her dressing table. "Hey, old man, stop," Debbie blurted out. Women liked shopping and also enjoyed undoing the wrappings. Sometimes it was a game, like how intact could I leave this if I just undid some corners? The struggle was real. Carlos was confused when she said that. Why is she mad at me again? When he didn't stop, Debbie ran toward him and took the other lipsticks away from him. "Aren't these all mine? I want to take the wrappings off." "So stop doing it." Carlos finally got the point and couldn't help but chuckle. He pulled her into his arms, kissed her on the forehead and said, "All right, have fun then. I'm going to take a bath." After saying that, he let go of her and walked towards the door. Watching Carlos leave, Debbie pouted and snapped, "Don't think I'll forgive you just because you apologized and got me a gift." His harsh words still stung. Carlos turned around and his face softened. "I know," he said. He knew she was a stubborn girl and would not forgive him that easily. But he believed that she would eventually forgive him if he treated her better. Maybe someday soon her heart would yield to him and she would be back to the lovely girl he used to know, the one he fell for. Silence blanketed the room after he left. There was nothing left to say, and no one around to say it to. Unable to resist the siren call of the lipsticks, Debbie sat in front of the dressing table and began to unpack the boxes. She took every shade out and organized the collection. She divided them into 2 piles, those she liked and those she didn't. She decided to send those she didn't like to her friends. Casey prefers bright colors while Christina loves soft ones. And Auntie will love this pale mauve one. Perfect, she thought to herself. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Carlos in a long nightshirt entering her bedroom. The plaid stripes couldn't hide the contours of his body. She put the containers of lipstick on the table and asked, "May I send these to my friends?" Carlos' face soured at her question. "You don't like them?" he asked. "Don't get me wrong. These particular ones just aren't me. It would be a waste of money keeping them," she explained. His face took on a more normal expression. "That's up to you. They're yours now." He walked toward the dressing table and opened the delicate box where she used to keep her lipsticks. The ones she had kept had similar hues to those she had bought before. Carlos could tell that she loved lipsticks with color like red, maple leaf red, blood red, wine red, ruby red. She also had 2 shades of pale mauve that she used when she didn't wear any other makeup. She was going to send those rose red, orange, and purple ones to her besties. After closing the box, Carlos suddenly remembered something. He went back to his bedroom and came back with a bad in his hand. "This is our company's latest bath and body line. Hope you like them. Never mind. Just wait for me. Inspiring minds, illuminating souls." After a couple of minutes, Debbie entered her bathroom to find Carlos pouring some bath oil into the tub. Her jaw dropped as she asked in utter disbelief, "Tell me, you did something wrong, right? And this is your way of saying sorry? Why is he suddenly being so good to me? He apologized to me earlier. And now Carlos Huo, the bus CEO of a multinational corporation, is even drawing my bath." She mused. She wondered if she were dreaming. This was absolutely unreal. It was not like she was a queen or even rich without his money. She was just Debbie. Where was this coming from? "Yes," he answered briefly. He shouldn't have said those harsh words. However, Debbie was now intrigued. She started to ask, "What did you do? Did you just happen to sleep with Megan when you went to her house to fetch the lipsticks?" "Debbie Nian," Carlos interrupted her as his face soured. He looked hurt and outraged, and it could be heard in his voice. Well, what was done was done. She couldn't take it back now. Debbie shut her mouth at once. As Carlos turned back to add the bath oil, she opened her mouth again. And again she pressed him. "If you really slept with her, you don't need to feel guilty. After all, out marriage is in name only. If you two really love each other, I'll just bow out owl. What are you doing? Let go of me." Debbie pulled her sweater tighter to her with both hands. Thanks to Carlos, her jacket now lay on the floor. "If you keep nagging, I'll bath you myself," he threatened. All right, I'll take a bath. "Now get out of here, will ya?" Debbie said. As the saying goes, those who suit their actions to the times are wise. Debbie decided it wasn't a good idea to anger Carlos again. He cast a cold glance at her before leaving the bathroom. After locking the door, Debbie heaved a long sigh of relief. "I thought he'd never leave," she thought. "He almost got me naked." She pondered this as she stripped off her clothing and was about to settle into the tub. It was quite warm, almost hot, so she put in one foot at a time, letting herself get used to the temperature. But it was just right to wash away the aches and pains of the day. She finally got all in and settled into the tub. That was when she realized something was wrong. I'm the one who's mad at him. Why should I listen to him? Getting out of the bathtub, she yawned. Then she took the body wash that Carlos gave her and foamed up. Her hands left trails of foam as she ran them over her body. "Wow, it smells like milk. I love it." Debbie could practically taste the shower gel. Then she washed the foam away under the shower. Her skin was not as smooth as other young girls because she had not paid special attention to it before. But after she applied the body lotion, she could feel her skin was much smoother. She might have to make a habit of this. It felt great. Looking at her naked body in the mirror, Debbie blushed and couldn't help touching her smooth leg. "I need to pay more attention to my skin. Otherwise, I might age quickly." Shrugging on her nightgown, she walked out of the bathroom with wet hair. She thought Carlos would be in the study working, but actually he was sitting on her bed, answering a phone call. What was he doing here? And why was he in here anyway? The moment she appeared, he turned his head and fixed his eyes upon her. Debbie sat at the dressing table, opened the tube of nighttime moisturizer and squeezed out some of the goo onto her hand. It wouldn't do to get all wrinkled, she thought as she worked the lotion onto her cheeks, around her nose, her forehead, everywhere on her face. She glanced at some of the other products and decided the anti-aging SPF 20 serum would be best in the morning. Then she reached into a drawer and found her blow dryer. Then, gadget in hand, she walked into the bathroom once more. While she was drying her hair in the bathroom, Carlos was on the phone with his assistant. "Tristan, I need 3 VIP cards for the spa on the 4th floor of Forecd building." Yeah, it's for my wife." 3? Oh, 1 for Mrs. Huo and 2 for her friends. Tristan got Carlos' point immediately and answered, "Yes, Mr. Huo, and build a lipstick research and development center in East District Manor and prepare all the necessary materials. She's going to love designing her own lipstick. Register a brand name, Dekar. We might need it in the future. Let's see, there was something else. Oh, I remember. She loves singing. So establish a music studio for her. Put a piano, a guitar, a digital audio workstation and other top-notch equipment in it. Yes, Mr. Huo. Tristan was secretly shocked, though. Since when did Mr. Huo become a slave to his wife? Carlos, however, was still pondering how he could be nicer to Debbie. She likes martial arts, but I don't think she needs it anymore. After all, I'll protect her in the future. She doesn't need to lift a finger to do that. Unravel the unknown. Unleash the unimaginable. One more thing. I need you to hand off your duties to someone else, including the tasks I just gave you. I need you to go and find me something. It is a rough diamond of pale blue. I saw it at auction once. The gem was pale blue and as clear as water. Carlos hadn't paid much attention to it back then. If memory served him, pale blue was Debbie's favorite color. Yes, Mr. Huo, Tristan answered. Get it no matter how much it costs. Yes, Mr. Huo. Having dried her hair, Debbie walked out of the bathroom and saw Carlos set his phone down on the nightstand. Standing beside the bed, she asked, "Not going back to your bedroom?" Without answering her question, he reached out and pulled her into his arms. The girl smelled like milk, turning him on. He lowered his head and was about to kiss her on the lips, but she turned her head and the kiss landed on her cheek instead. He looked at her and said, "I told you before, we're a couple. I want you. Get on the bed." "No." "Listen, I agreed to sleep in the villa instead of the dorm like you wanted. Keep it in your pants. It's perfectly normal for a couple to sleep together." Before she could refuse him, he picked her up and laid her on the bed. Debbie was about to struggle, but he turned off the lights and held her tight. "Sleep now. I'll only go to sleep after you leave my room. Otherwise, I can't." "You don't want to sleep? No problem. Let's do something more fun." The next second, she felt all of his weight on top of her, pressing her back into the bed. In the dark, he kissed her full on the lips. She thought he would continue, but he let go of her, turned around and lay beside her, panting. "Sleep," he said in a husky voice. Early the next morning, when Debbie went down the stairs and sat at the dining room table, Carlos already finished his breakfast. He looked at Debbie and said, "We didn't get to the third condition yesterday. Mind telling me what it was?" "What? The third condition? I totally forgot. What was it again?" It took a while before she finally remembered what her third condition was. It was hard to concentrate with everything going on. I haven't seen Emmett recently. Do you know where he is?" Debbie went sober when she thought of Emmett, who must be crying and alone at the construction site now. Carlos immediately realized what she was going to say. There was a reason for Emmett's exile, and his wife wasn't going to undo that. It wasn't any of her business anyway. With a sullen face, he stood up from his chair and said in a cold voice, "He's busy." Putting her chopsticks on the table, Debbie ran toward Philip and grabbed Carlos' suit coat. She then ran toward Carlos and said with a flattering smile, "Let me help you put this on. Though we're a couple in name only." Before she could finish her sentence, she was interrupted by an angry Carlos. "We are not a couple in name only." "Oops, sorry. Won't say that again." She helped him put his arm in a sleeve, and when she was about to help with other sleeve, she remembered she was still made at him. She immediately let go of the coat. Luckily, Carlos grabbed the coat himself. Otherwise, it would have fallen onto the floor. He cast a cold glance at her and shrugged on his coat without saying a word. The smile on her face disappeared as she stated in a cold voice, "I haven't forgiven you yet. If you want me to forgive you, then don't get Emmett involved in our fight. After all, it was I who threatened him to keep my identity a secret. He had no choice. It has nothing to do with me," he answered indifferently. Debbie didn't expect him to say that, or act like that. What a petty man. Fine. Maybe my feminine wiles. Can you please let him come back? She asked in a soft voice. Can you please stop being mad at me? He asked in reply. Reluctantly, she answered, Okay, I'm not mad at you anymore. Then I'll let him come back when I'm not angry at him anymore, he offered. Debbie jumped to her feet and snapped, Then I won't forgive you. Poor Emmett. He'll have to haul around bricks on that construction site for a long time, he sighed. He turned around and walked towards the gates. Debbie's jaw dropped. She wanted to find a way to bargain with the man. But after he had changed his shoes, she hadn't figured it out yet. She could only run towards him and hold his arm tightly. I'm not mad at you now. Can you just forgive Emmett this time? Come on, old man. Trying hard to suppress his laughter, Philip opened the gate for Carlos and wondered, Debbie is so cute. She knows how to deal with Mr. Huo. He's a sucker for sweetness, but never command him to do anything. What did you just call me? Carlos asked in a cold voice. He never liked that epithet much, and saw no reason to do anything for her when she was like that. He liked to have everything under his control. Embarrassed, Debbie cast a glance at Philip. He immediately got her point and left the villa. Once she was sure Philip was out of earshot, she held Carlos' arm and said, Honey, in a sweet voice. Satisfied, Carlos smiled, but he feigned anger as asked in a stern voice, He's that important to you? You're going to do what I want just for him. It's not what you think. There's nothing going on between Emmett and me. The day we met at Shining International Plaza, I only asked him not to tell you who I was. It's so unfair that he's being punished because of me. Can you forgive him and let him come back? Otherwise, this whole thing will weigh me down. I may not be able to lift the spoon at the dining table. In her usual playful manner, Debbie forgot how important this was for Emmett and trailed off into a joke. Carlos pried her hand off and left her with a terse message as he left for work. Be attentive in your lessons. Debbie felt frustrated. I begged so hard and he left me hanging? He didn't even say whether he had forgiven Emmett or not. After the yoga lesson, Debbie went back to school with the lipsticks, but Carlos' attitude bugged her no end. In the dormitory, Debbie gave out the lipsticks to Casey and Christina. Upon receiving those limited edition shades, Casey held her tightly and gave her a peck on the cheek. Tomboy, you are a goddess. Christina tried a magenta lip gloss. She looked great wearing that color. Debbie, these lipsticks cost $2, $9.99 each, and you gave me more than one. Why are you being silly? You told us you needed money. Why didn't you sell them online? Debbie propped her hand against her chin and answered, I don't want to bother. Besides, I don't like this color and you have been talking a lot about how you love it. So I thought it was perfect to give them to you guys. Meanwhile, Casey removed the fuchsia shade she had just put on and looked at Debbie mischievously. Have you and your husband made up? She asked. Debbie hesitated, not sure how to put it. Sort of. She had every reason to be angry, but whenever she saw Carlos, she calmed down without knowing why. Making up is good, Debbie. You need to give your all to each other, and that can only happen when both of you are at peace. You have our blessing for that. I'm a big, big girl, in a big, big world. Debbie's ringtone went off, interrupting them. Right then, it was Tristan. Hello, Tristan, she answered cheerily. Mrs. Huo, Mr. Huo had some items delivered to you. Ashley Run, another assistant to Mr. Huo, has arrived at your school parking lot. Afraid that you won't take her call since you don't know her phone number, she asked me to inform you about it in advance. Okay, thanks, but what items? Debbie asked as she stood up from a chair. You'll know when you see them. Ashley Run drives the company's vehicle. License plate 5566. It seemed Tristan was at the airport, as over the phone, Debbie could hear departure and arrival announcements in the background. Okay, on my way. Thank you, Tristan. My pleasure, Mrs. Huo. You can also take your friends with you if you want. Debbie couldn't make head or tail of Tristan's words. At last, she took Casey and Christina with her to the school parking lot, where at the entrance stood a white Mercedes SUV, which drew a lot of attention. Many students stopped to admire the sleek car. Some girls even fantasized about a Prince Charming behind the wheel. However, when they found out that the driver was a woman, they left with disappointment. From a distance, Debbie saw a middle-aged woman in a black uniform lingering by the car. "Hi, are you Ashley Wren?" Debbie asked when they got near. Ashley Wren pushed her glasses up and replied respectfully, "Yes, Mrs. Huo. I'm Ashley Wren, Mr. Huo's assistant. I came here to deliver some items for you." Ashley Wren was not a gossip, but she was amazed at how beautiful and young the CEO's wife was. After some polite remarks, she took out a bag from the car and handed it to Debbie. "Mrs. Huo, here are 3 VIP cards for the biggest SPA on the 4th floor of Forecd building. If you have no plans tonight, why don't you and your friends go there and sample their services?" The 3 girls were surprised to know what the secretary was there for. Debbie took the bag. There were 3 embossed boxes. She opened one of them, in which was enclosed a gilded card from the Divana Nurture SPA. In each card was enclosed a $50 000 VIP card. Christina could not believe what she was seeing. She covered her mouth with her hand and said, "Thank you, but I can't accept it. I'll stay by Debbie's side and take care of her for Mr. Huo with or without the card." Having already taken a $1 million VIP card from Carlos, she felt it was too embarrassing for her to take this one too. Thinking the same, Casey held Debbie's arm and looked at Ashley Wren. "Please thank Mr. Huo for us. We feel honored to be Debbie's friends, but we can't accept these cards. Please take Christina's card and mine back." "Thank you." Ashley Wren returned Debbie's friends an approving look and observed, "Mr. Huo hopes that Mrs. Huo can have your company when she hits the SPA." When the other 2 girls heard this, for a moment they couldn't frame a response. However, Christina still thought they ought to refuse the cards. "We understand. We'll accompany Debbie when she goes to the SPA, but we don't have to accept the cards." Casey echoed, "Debbie, just keep your card. I'll keep you company to next time you want to go to the SPA. I can ask my dad for more pocket money to afford a place on my own." She used to have some sauna and beauty salon cards, but she couldn't afford a VIP card for the 4th floor of Forecd building. Nonetheless, for Debbie, Casey would ask her dad for some financial support. She assumed that her dad would help her out if she mentioned that Debbie was Carlos' wife. Without saying a word, Ashley Wren only smiled at the girls. "The ball is in your court," she said calmly as she waited for a final decision from Debbie herself. Debbie understood her friends. She felt stumped. After a while, she decided to call Carlos. "Old man." She began on the phone after she had excused herself and gone to a little distance from her friends and Ashley Wren. What did you just call me?" Carlos asked in a deep voice that made Debbie blush. Ashley Wren has brought the cards to me, but I'm afraid we can't take them. My friends and I rarely go to a SPA," she explained. What she said was the truth for her girlfriends. They were young, lively ladies, whose skin didn't need much of special care. Besides, Debbie had more than enough for her plate without having unnecessary troubles about her appearance. A girl is supposed to have an exquisite life. Do I have to tell you that? According to what Carlos had found out, Debbie had learned to make do with little she had, ever since her father passed away. Such luxuries as spa treatment were things she had had to cut out completely, and she was doing just fine until Carlos came along. Even so, from the handsome monthly allowances he gave her, Debbie only took what was enough to cover her usual expenses. He couldn't stand her being so harsh on herself. It made his heart ache. Discover, devour, delight. This is just the beginning. The title of Mrs. Huo comes with a lot of duties and privileges as well. As my wife, you'll have to learn the ropes. I take you to various social activities and to meet friends. So you have to enhance yourself on every level. All right? But if you don't like to socialize, I won't force you. But you have to promise me something. Be good to yourself. The first step of being good to yourself is to treat yourself to something nice. 5 minutes later, when they hung up the phone, Debbie was convinced. She took the cards and thanked Ashley Runn for the delivery. I was just doing my job. Bye, Mrs. Huo, Ashley Runn replied. After Ashley had driven away, Debbie took out 2 embossed boxes and handed one each to her friends. Here, I don't want to take the card either, but I guess we all have to. Besides, it's only a small sum for Mr. Huo anyway. He said if you don't accept the cards, then that means you don't see me as your friend. So, just take it, both of you. VEPSILON. A universe of stories awaits. But Debbie, when we were on the 5th floor of the Alioth building the other day, we had already accepted a $1 million VIP card. We really feel embarrassed to take this one as well, Christina said. I don't know. It beats me how that capitalist's mind works, Debbie responded, shaking her head. She could imagine how awkward they were feeling to be forced to accept VIP cards with huge sums of money in them, especially from another woman's husband. She would probably feel the same if she were put in the same situation. Never mind. Since Mr. Huo insists, let's just take it, she said to her friends. That evening, Debbie decided to have a talk with Carlos. However, she was informed by Emmett, who had just returned, that Carlos had left on a business trip and wouldn't be back for at least a month. With Carlos away, she was hoping to have some relief from her busy schedule. But it was not going to happen. Carlos had already organized a list of activities for her to do and bid someone to supervise her in his absence. During the day, she had yoga and dance lessons. To make sure that she stayed busy, Carlos also arranged other various activities such as flower arrangement, tea parties, art exhibitions, bowling, women's baseball, and so on. In the evening, she was expected to have either a milk bath or a rose petal bath. Debbie was frustrated with this way of life. It was the lifestyle of an upper-class socialite diva and not hers. She wanted her own simple, easy life back. Just as she was about to go crazy, Carlos finally returned from the business trip. He had been away for more than 2 months. At the start, they had texted each other on the phone. But when Debbie had complained to him about the lessons and activities that he had arranged for her, he had simply replied, I did this for your own good. Debbie didn't contact him again after that. Later, she found out that Carlos had put her name down for a dance program at her school's Solar New Year Gala. Debbie was so angry she gritted her teeth and felt like punching him in the face for it. But she didn't call or text him. The day that Carlos returned happened to be when the Solar New Year Gala was held. Since the New Year was on Sunday, the gala was held 3 days earlier. Debbie anxiously waited on the stage dressed in a classical-style azure dance costume. When the curtains parted and the spotlight lit up the stage, the audience was stunned to see Debbie there. She twirled and jumped, moving her body smoothly and gracefully. Everyone was in awe and wondered when Debbie had become so elegant and charming. When the dance finished, the audience gave her a standing ovation that echoed throughout the whole venue. Even though her performance was a huge success, Debbie didn't feel happy within herself. She smiled and bowed politely to the audience and then left the stage. Changing back into her own clothes, she headed home. I won't ever speak to that dreadful man again. Even when he is not around, he still manages to torture me. He must be thrilled that the dance was such a success. It was all for him. I didn't want to do it, she thought angrily as she reached the villa. She opened the front door and went in. While she was feeling around in the dark for the light switch, someone held her from behind. She jumped back startled. But the hug felt familiar and she knew instantly that it was him. Turning her, he silenced her scream with a kiss. Even though it was dark, Debbie could sense that something wasn't quite right. She could smell the unusually sweet metallic scent of blood. Alarmed, she wriggled out of his embrace and quickly turned the lights on. When she looked at Carlos, he was holding his bleeding arm. "What happened?" she asked nervously. Carlos' face was pale and sweating from the pain. "I'll be fine. Call this number and tell him to come quickly," he said, trying to control his excitement at seeing her again. "Let me drive you to the hospital. It will be quicker." Debbie threw her bag onto the floor and was about to help him to the car. But Carlos stopped her. "We need to keep this quiet, especially from the press. Can you help me upstairs? The number that I gave you to call is a doctor." After Debbie had called the doctor, she turned to Carlos, visually upset. "I'm surprised that you still remember you had a home after being away for such a long time. Look at you. You've gotten yourself hurt like this. Somebody may think that I did this to you," she complained as she helped him climb the stairs. Once they reached the top, Carlos stopped and turned to look at her. He touched her cheek gently. "I saw your performance tonight. You were breathtaking," he said sincerely. On hearing that, Debbie suddenly remembered everything that she had to endure for the past 2 months, while he was away on his business trip. Tears welled in her eyes. "Carlos Huo, you're such a jerk. You kept controlling my schedule even when you were gone. All the things that you made me do are for divas and socialites, not for me. Okay, then don't do them anymore." When Carlos saw the sadness in Debbie's eyes, his heart softened. He didn't want to push her anymore. "Do you really mean it? Or are you just saying that now because I am helping you? Do you remember what you said to me when I first complained to you about it? You said that it was for my own good. Why are you letting me quit everything now?" Debbie had complained about it to him only once. When she got his response, she was so angry that she didn't contact him anymore after that. But what infuriated her even more was the fact that he never called or texted her either. "I've agreed to let you stop because I don't want to see you upset." Perhaps what she said was true. The classes and activities really didn't suit her. She was wild and free-spirited. Forcing those things on her wouldn't work. He was surprised that she didn't come and find him abroad and argue the point with him face to face. "The past 2 months have been unbearable for me. I thought I was going mad from all of the tedious activities that you had inflicted upon me. And now, suddenly you are being nice and trying to make everything okay. No, it just won't do." She was sobbing slightly, but she also dramatized a little to make it all sound much worse than it really was. Debbie helped Carlos onto the bed. Once he seemed comfortable enough, she turned to leave. But Carlos grabbed her hand. "I'm sorry for everything I made you go through. I won't do it again," he apologized. This time, she couldn't contain her emotions anymore. Her tears spilled down her cheeks and she wept openly. She raised her fist and was about to punch him in the arm. But when she saw the injury, she aimed for his chest. Even though Carlos was hurt, Debbie was still no match for him. He caught her hand and pulled her into his arms. "We haven't seen each other for 2 months. Didn't you miss me? Why would I miss you?" "No, I didn't miss you at all," she lied. With her cheek against his chest, she felt awkward and began to fidget. Also, she took care not to accidentally touch his injured arm. "But I missed you a lot," he confessed. At his words, her heart began to beat faster in her chest and her cheeks flushed red hot. Stuck for a response, she decided to change the subject. "How did you get hurt? Were you trying to protect some woman?" she asked casually, having a dig at him. Carlos fell into a silence. Debbie's heart sank at his response. She stood up and glared at him. "So I was right." She felt a pang in her heart. "Do you know why Wesley and I decided to foster Megan?" because her parents both died a horrible death to cover us. She soon realized that the woman he had tried to protect was Megan. Debbie wasn't sure what she was feeling anymore. It was complicated. Part of her felt that Carlos had done the right thing while the rest of her felt like crying. She was so conflicted. Carlos continued. Megan was only 12 at the time and she watched her parents die. The horror was too much for even Wesley and me to bear, let alone for her, who was only a little girl. Stimulated by what had happened in front of her, her asthma had come back. She was taken to hospital soon enough to just save her life. It was a painful day for everyone. She could have died that day. Dive into stories, embrace enchantment. Imagining the horrible scene, which was even difficult for a tough guy like Carlos to describe, Debbie immediately felt sympathetic towards Megan. She now thought that Carlos had done the right thing by saving the girl this time, though he had gotten himself badly wounded. Debbie banished all the negative feelings in her heart and said, "I'll go check if the doctor has come." Then she turned and walked towards the door. Carlos didn't stop her. He slowly passed out as Debbie walked down the stairs. A few minutes later, Debbie came back to the room with the doctor at her heels. As she saw the man lying there, motionless, his eyes closed, her body went stiff with uncontrollable fear. She ran over to the bed to check on him, and she saw that the bed was soaked with the blood from his wounds. Carlos, she called. Tears welled up in her eyes the minute Carlos' name escaped her lips. "Wake up. Please don't scare me like this." She patted his face softly, trying to wake him up. "I'll be good. I'll attend all the classes you've arranged for me. I'll do everything you've asked me to do. Just wake up. Please," she begged. Carlos' eyes slowly fluttered open. Looking at the wailing girl by his bedside, he asked in a hoarse voice, "Really?" Debbie stopped crying and nodded repeatedly. She sighed, relieved to hear his voice. "Yes, I promise. Just don't go passing out on me again. Okay?" The doctor got everything ready for his immediate treatment. "Mr. Huo, I'll stop the bleeding first," he said, swiftly getting to work on Carlos' wounds. A trace of smile appeared on Carlos' pale face when he looked at Debbie's tear-stained face. "Be a good girl now and don't cry anymore. Wait for me outside, all right?" To get out of the doctor's way so that he could efficiently do his job without any disturbances, she left the room quietly and waited outside. Strong feelings surged inside her which she felt she had to share. Too anxious to wait to see her friends in person, Debbie decided to talk to them on the phone right away. She typed a confession into her message box. "I think I have fallen for Carlos Huo." Christina was the first to respond. "Isn't that quite normal? He's perfect. Even though I have a boyfriend, I still would love to be with Carlos." Christina wouldn't stop talking when it came to Carlos. However, Debbie didn't reply to her statement. There was too much going on in her mind at that moment. She had to spill it all out. She continued to type, "He has arranged a lot of classes for me. Although I don't like any of them, so far I have gone to all the classes. He always has this straight, calm face. When I think of him, I am afraid, but I also feel happy." Casey didn't comment, but just nodded at the phone screen. She had always hoped that sparks would fly between Debbie and her husband. It was finally happening. "He's actually so good to me. He knows what my favorite food is and always asks Julie to cook whatever I like. He knows that I have a huge appetite, but he never complains about me eating too much or worries about me getting fat. And when we got out, he ordered so much food for me." Debbie went on. When they dined at Alioth building the other day, her friends could tell that Carlos treated her preciously. "It is true that he is cold and condescending, but when we are alone, he is gentle to me." That text came as a shock to Jared, who found it hard to connect the word gentle to Carlos. "Gentle? Mr. Huo? What's that like?" He knows that Casey and Christina are my good friends. So when he buys VIP cards for me, he never forgets about them. Christina and Casey nodded viciously at that statement. Thanks to Debbie, now each of them had more than 10 VIP passes to all kinds of fancy places. I got so mad when another woman sat in the passenger seat of his car. I got mad when he stayed in Megan's room for too long. I was so angry when he was good to her. Sounds like love to me, Jared thought as he read her messages. In J City, he had rescued me. I didn't tell him this at the time, but I was really touched by his care for me. Jared rolled his eyes and thought, women always tend to be grateful to the person who saves them in an emergency. In Debbie's case, that person was Carlos. There was an infinite possibility of romance between them. Pained me so much when I saw him wounded. All my anger vanished in an instant. Is Mr. Huo wounded? Everyone wondered when they saw Debbie's message. He is my husband, he is handsome, and he has the most perfect body. After he found out that I'm his wife, he did everything in my interest. Why am I still hesitant to be intimate with him? Is there something wrong with my head? Casey couldn't hold herself anymore. She typed, your head is fine. Maybe you're just frigid in bed. Debbie's wistfulness was expelled by Casey's words. She looked at her phone and laughed. The rest of the group posted the rolling on the floor laughing emojis. Debbie sent several crying face with a hammer over the head emojis and mentioned Casey in her next text. You're the one who is frigid in bed. Every time they got down to have sex, she was as eager as he was. But the road always got bumpy. It hadn't yet happened for them, for some reason or the other. Carlos had managed to control his urge every time things went south or when Debbie wasn't in the mood. His self-control was beyond her imagination. In fact, she was so stunned sometimes that she suspected if he had some physical problem. But since she could clearly feel his erection against her, she knew that was not the case. Perhaps he truly respected her and didn't want to force her into it. When she thought of all this, tears filled her eyes again. She turned to look at the closed door beyond which Carlos was lying wounded. She thought of Megan. If only she could beat the hell out of that culprit. Megan was the reason why her husband was bleeding in bed. Carlos had told her that Megan's parents had saved his life. So he felt like he owed that girl and was indebted to her. Ark! Debbie yelled, troubled by all these contradicting thoughts. She stopped crying and pounded the wall fiercely with her fist. Meanwhile, her friends were still talking to her in the group chat. Debbie, has something happened to Mr. Huo? Dixon asked. Yes, but it's confidential. Keep it to yourselves, please, she said. Debbie regretted having blurted out Carlos' injury. She was worried if it would lead to some trouble for Carlos, the news of his injury was leaked. But she also believed that her friends wouldn't betray her. Isn't he on a business trip? Debbie's friends asked in unison. They all knew that Carlos had gone on a business trip 2 months ago. He came back out of the blue. And to my surprise, he told me he saw my performance. I wonder how. She mused if he had gone to her school to see the performance. Yet considering the depth of his injury, it seemed unlikely. Tomboy, after watching you dance, I really think that Mr. Huo has done all this for your own good. He has turned you into such an elegant, glowing woman, Christina said proudly. What, elegant and glowing? Really? Are you talking about me? Come on. Debbie was surprised that her friends thought of her that way. Casey agreed gladly with Christina on that. She said, Chris is right. Moreover, your skin is much better now too. Your hands used to be rough and covered in calluses. But the last time I held your hand, it was soft and smooth like silk. And that time in the bathroom, I saw that your skin had become fairer and rosy. I almost drooled all over you. Debbie blushed at her comments. Okay, stop. Don't talk about all that stuff with the boys here. Delete it, Debbie demanded. Casey immediately deleted her message. But Jared posted a grinning face emoji and said, "Too late. I already saw it. Tomboy, next time we meet, let's take a bath together. I want to see how good your skin really is. Back off. Wait until I tell Carlos about that comment." Jared was terrified and deleted that message immediately. "My mistake. Please forget that I even said it," he pleaded. The fact that Debbie was Carlos' wife alone was enough to forbid Jared from wanting anything more than friendship from her. Even if he were the bravest man on earth, he wouldn't dare to cross the threshold with Carlos' wife. Christina sent a heart eyes emoji, followed by her fantasy. "I want to sleep in Debbie's arms." Dixon replied right away with a worried face emoji. "What about me? What'll happen to me then?" The others hooted. Later, 2 of the doctor's assistants came to the villa to bring some medicine to the doctor. They walked into the room Carlos was being operated in. After that, another wait of 2 hours was steadily breaking Debbie's resolve. No one had come out of the room yet, and Debbie was so anxious to know what was going on inside that she was on the verge of barging in. About a half more hour later, the door of the room finally opened and the 2 assistants walked out. "How is my husband? Is he going to be all right?" Debbie dashed towards them as soon as they stepped out of the room. "Both of the bullets from inside him have been removed. The surgery is almost finished. Dr. Jiang is just performing the finishing work, making sure there are no chances of future trouble," they reassured her. Debbie was a bit relieved now. "Can I go in there?" she asked. "A few more minutes, please. Dr. Jiang will be coming out soon." "Okay, then." 15 minutes later, the doctor came out of the room. He removed his mask, looking exhausted. "The bullets have been removed and we've managed to stop the bleeding. But I think it would be best if you took Mr. Huo to hospital. After all, there is no proper medical apparatus in the villa," he stated. "I see. Thank you, Doctor." Debbie nodded. Dr. Jiang didn't know exactly who this girl was, but since Carlos had kept her around especially when he was wounded, he assumed that she must be someone special to Carlos. Thinking of that, the doctor replied respectfully, "Don't mention it. Emmett and Tristan will be here in a minute. Please don't hesitate to call me if I'm needed." "Okay, thanks. Please let me walk you out. I'll show myself out. You can go see Mr. Huo now." "All right. Thanks, Doctor." Emmett and Tristan arrived at the villa very soon. When Debbie saw them, she was shocked to notice that Tristan himself was limping. It looked like his left leg was wounded as well. Debbie was concerned, but Tristan told her not to worry. The wound had already been attended to in the hospital. It was nothing. He also told her that it happened after he and Carlos had gotten off the plane. They left the airport and went to rescue Megan. Both he and Carlos were wounded. The fear that ensued had triggered Megan's asthma, and she was being taken care of in the hospital right now. With Emmett's and Tristan's help, Debbie moved Carlos from her bedroom to his. Her bedclothes were changed, and for safety and hygienic purposes, the old blood-stained ones were destroyed. It wasn't until the next morning that Carlos finally woke up. Discover your next adventure at Sigma Nu Epsilon Iota Eta. He opened his eyes, and the first thing that fell into his eyes was Debbie sleeping beside him. She had barely slept the night before. Looking at her haggard face, Carlos put his good arm around her shoulders and kissed her forehead. When Debbie woke up, Carlos was sitting on the bed perusing some files. She sat up still muddled in her sleep and remarked sleepily, "Oh, hey, you're back." As soon as she finished the sentence, she sensed that something was wrong with it. Then she remembered Carlos coming back the day before. The bandage on his right arm reminded her that the wound wasn't a dream. "Did you sleep well? Are you hungry?" He put the files aside and looked at her with tender eyes. She seemed totally awake now. It was all real. "You got hurt because of Megan. Debbie muttered in a slightly horrified tone. The fact was still too hard for her to process. Hearing her words, Carlos scooped her cheek with one hand and tried to comfort her. "Deb, you know that—" I know, she said resignedly. After getting out of bed, she prattled on. "I'm going downstairs for breakfast. Then we're going to the hospital. Dr. Jiang said your wound needed to be treated in the hospital, or else it is going to fall prey to inflammation or infection." Carlos was recovering quickly. Debbie was surprised to see him able to be on his feet already, and he looked like $1,000,000. "I don't need to go to the hospital," he protested. Debbie turned her head back and threatened, "Fine, then you can ask Megan to come over and look after you. I don't want to take care of a stubborn patient." Carlos was left speechless. He recalled how tender and sweet she had been when she had danced on the stage the other day. Sadly, that side of her appeared only briefly. Debbie got dressed in her bedroom and went downstairs. In the dining room, Julie was heating up the dishes for Debbie. She had already gotten a call from Carlos asking her to do so before Debbie could get downstairs. After a simple breakfast, Debbie went back to Carlos' room. "Hey, are you going to the hospital or not?" she asked sullenly. "If you're worried about me, just call the doctor in. It would be much simpler that way in any case. The doctor was here yesterday. He said there was no medical equipment here and you would receive better treatment at the hospital. This is the doctor's advice, not mine. Why are you fighting this?" Debbie got exasperated, and once again, Carlos was left nothing to retort. Debbie ground her teeth, angry at the man's stubbornness. "If you plan on acting like this, then I'm leaving. I won't come back until your wound is healed." She had hardly taken one step before Carlos took her wrist and agreed resignedly, "I'll go." Debbie secretly chuckled and then assumed a serious look again. After prying Carlos' hand away, she said, "I'll go get your clothes." However, when Debbie opened Carlos' closet, she was stunned at the tidiness and cleanness it was sporting. The clothes and accessories were arranged in such an order as the kind one would witness if they were being displayed in a showcase in a mall. Since Carlos wanted to keep his injury from the press, Debbie picked out a pair of sweatpants, an extra thick white sweatshirt, and a white baseball cap for him. She had never seen him dressed like that, so she assumed the press wouldn't be able to recognize him in this outfit. It looked low-key enough. She put the clothes on the bed and ordered, "There, get changed." Carlos shifted his look from her to his right arm and then back to her again, saying, "I'm injured. You'll have to help me dress." For a moment, Debbie didn't know how to respond. Then she said, "I'll go get help." When Carlos had come back from abroad, some servants had come back to the villa with him. "Do you really want another woman to see your husband naked?" Carlos called out behind her. Debbie exhaled helplessly. "Fine, I'll help you change your clothes." Carlos had gotten her there. She really didn't want another woman to see her husband's body. Fortunately, it was not so much work except for the teasing part. Carlos didn't behave at all when she was changing his pants. When she was dressing him in the sweatshirt, she accidentally bumped into his chest and left him a kiss. "Deb, you naughty girl, you're seducing me." His body instantly went stiff when her soft lips touched his skin. As if out of instincts, he wrapped his left arm around her. Debbie's face flamed with embarrassment. She felt like it was on fire. She covered her burning face with the back of her hand and said, "It's an accident. You're too tall. I got tripped. How about we go to the hospital after?" He whispered in her ear in a tempting voice. After what?" "After some dessert," he continued, sniffing her hair. "What are you thinking?" Realizing what he was implying, Debbie gave him a pinch on the waist. "Quit joking around. Hurry up." Her heart was pounding, but she pushed him away. In a fluster, She grabbed his left arm hurriedly and tucked it into the sleeve. Not giving up, Carlos continued with his seduction. Honey, only my arm is wounded. My other parts are as good as new. If you don't believe me, why don't you go ahead and examine them yourself?
Come?
Debbie tried to project an angry tone to cover up her nervousness. In your dreams, smartass. Now let's go to the hospital.
Okay, fine, Carlos replied resignedly.
You know, I intended to have a passionate night with you yesterday, but this injury totally ruined my plans, he confessed. He had been patient with Debbie for a long time. If he waited any longer, he was afraid that something wrong could happen to his manhood. Debbie gave him a glare and seized the opportunity to complain. You should have known better than to get yourself injured. Maybe God doesn't want you to get your own way. If that had been the case, then my injuries wouldn't have landed on my arm. Deb, I can push myself up with one arm. How about we have a try? Debbie's heart was racing, and she could hardly maintain her composure anymore. Carlos seemed odd to her today. He kept hitting on her, and as if that wasn't enough to throw her off the mark, he was very handsy as well. Desperate for a way to contain her surging emotions, she stomped on his foot and snapped, albeit frivolously, "Keep your hands off me!" Carlos was amused by the shy and annoyed expression on her face. He bowed his head and kissed her forehead softly before whispering, "Honey, I'll go to the hospital with you, but I think I deserve a reward for the trouble." Hearing him call her honey again, Debbie couldn't help smiling and taunted quietly, "And what reward does this child want?" "This, of course." He pulled her into his arms and kissed her deeply on the lips. Nothing else could be heard anymore in the room except for the heavy breathing of the two. Some time later, Debbie walked out of Carlos' room again with burning cheeks, looking definitely rumpled. She fetched a mask from her bedroom and asked Carlos to put it on. Just as they were about to leave, Debbie reminded him to put on a pair of sunglasses too. After that, she took a glance at him and decided that everything was finally set now. They left the villa and headed for the hospital. Emmett had already made an appointment for them with the doctor. In the consulting room, the doctor looked at Carlos wound carefully and changed his dressing. It took about 2 hours to complete the process, after which they left the doctor's consulting room. Debbie had been under the impression that they would be heading back to the villa immediately. But to her surprise, Carlos was holding her hand and leading her to the inpatient department. "Where are we going?" she asked in confusion. "The inpatient department. Megan was hospitalized and is being kept under observation." Hearing Megan's name, Debbie didn't respond and just followed him silently. Hardly had they reached the door of the ward before they heard the sound of Megan's laughter emanating cheerfully from inside, in stark contrast to the hospital's general ambience. At that point, Debbie noticed an evident smile on her husband's face, and secretly made a face in disapproval. Walking inside, they noticed that Damon and Wesley were already there. Megan was sitting on the edge of the bed, giggling at Damon's jokes. Her eyes brightened when she saw Carlos and Debbie. She ran towards Carlos, calling in a cheerful voice, "Ah, Uncle Carlos, you are here. Are you okay? Does it still hurt?" Seeing her trotting over, Carlos released Debbie's hand and spread his arms to catch the girl.
I'm fine.
"But you be careful. You shouldn't do anything strenuous right now." "I'm fine too, but Uncle Wesley won't allow me to leave the hospital," the girl complained as she buried herself in his arms. Now, no complaints. Uncle Wesley is doing that for your own good." Carlos pulled her out of his arms and rebuked her. "Aunt Debbie is here too. I didn't hear you greet her." As if she had just seen Debbie, Megan put on an embarrassed look and apologized. "Hi, Aunt Debbie.
I'm sorry.
I was too worried about Uncle Carlos. He was wounded because of me and I feel so bad about it." Debbie tried hard to suppress the discomfort in her heart. Don't. Uncle Carlos did the right thing in protecting you. After all, your parents saved his life, she replied flatly. Ah, so Uncle Carlos told you about it? Yes. Your Uncle Carlos and I are married. Married couples don't have secrets. Debbie took Carlos' hand with a smile, interlocked fingers with him, and looked up at her man affectionately. Carlos squeezed her hand and met her eyes. Tenderness could be seen from a mile away in his eyes. Discover your next adventure at Sigma Nu Epsilon Iota Eta. He was a lot more than happy to hear what she had just said. Hey, did you guys come here to visit Megan, or to torment us single people with your affections and flirting? Damon retorted from the bed, fed up with the sweetness between the two. Within a second, the tenderness in Carlos' eyes was all gone. It looked like he had turned into a completely different person. Casting him a cold stare, he snarled, "Well, you can just go away then. Shit, Carlos, we've been friends for more than a decade now. But you are not at all gentle to me. Worse than that, you asked me to go away. I guess you forget your friends when you're with your wife." Damon complained with a careless expression on his face and his hands in his pockets. "Well then, friend, tell me, how come you never visited me after I got injured?" Carlos retorted. All his friends had visited him at the villa after the injury except Damon last night. However, Damon didn't feel guilty at all. Instead, he confessed, "Look, in my heart, Megan is much more important than you. It would be obvious to anyone that I would want to make sure she was okay before I came to see you." Hearing him say that she was more important than Carlos, Megan laughed. She walked over to Damon, grabbed his sleeve, and appealed like a spoiled brat. "Uncle Damon, you're the best." "Of course." Damon put his arm around Megan's shoulders and looked at Carlos provocatively. Carlos ignored him. "What did the doctor say?" he asked Wesley, who had been looking out the window the entire time and seemed the least interested in their rift. "Asthma again. But it's fine. She can be discharged from hospital tomorrow." Wesley withdrew his gaze from outside and finally turned towards them slowly. Carlos didn't reply. He pulled Debbie closer to him and sat down on the sofa with her. Crossing his legs, he settled in comfortably and watched Megan and Damon chat and laugh together. A moment later, the door of the ward opened again. Curtis and Colleen walked in. "Debbie," Curtis greeted as soon as he saw Debbie. "Hi, mister." Debbie was about to stand up to greet the man, but Carlos pulled her back to the sofa and wrapped his arms around her. She looked at him with a perplexed gaze. Carlos explained his stance, though in a highly indifferent tone. "This is a hospital, not a school. You don't have to be so polite to him." Curtis only smiled at his unfriendly remarks. Debbie rolled her eyes at Carlos helplessly and greeted Curtis and Colleen once again. "Hi, Mr. Liu."
Guyen.
Curtis nodded and walked over to Megan. Colleen, on the other hand, walked closer to Debbie and asked, "How's Carlos' arm?" Debbie was puzzled. She looked at Colleen, who was smiling at her, and wondered, "Carlos is right here. Why doesn't she ask him directly? Why is she asking me?" Before she could recollect her thoughts and respond, Colleen said in a louder voice, "Debbie, you're Carlos' wife. Why is it so embarrassing to talk about your husband's injury?" Debbie was confused too much by the situation to form a coherent answer. Seeing confusion written all over her face, Colleen pulled her away from Carlos, took her arm and whispered with a smile, "Last night, when we got to the villa, you were sleeping beside him like a piggy. You must have been really tired from taking care of Carlos." It was only now that Debbie realized she and Curtis had dropped by the villa the night before. It only dawned on her now that there were so many people who had watched her sleep. Debbie turned her head and rolled her eyes at Carlos. "Why didn't you wake me up when Colleen dropped by last night?" Seeing how cute the two were being together, Colleen laughed. It was only now that she remembered to ask about Megan. "Megan, when will you leave the hospital?" Megan replied in a sweet voice, Thank you for asking, Colleen. I'll be discharged tomorrow morning. Curtis reminded her. Call her Aunt Colleen. Before Megan could respond, Colleen said, What aunt? We're not married yet. Curtis walked over to stand at her side and smiled. Do you think you can get rid of me? You're stuck with me, woman. Colleen blushed and made a face at him. I need to borrow Debbie for a minute. You guys go ahead. Then she took Debbie's hand and led her away to the door.
Journey beyond the imagination with Nevi.
After they walked out of the ward, Colleen looked at Debbie and said worriedly, About Carlos saving Megan, don't overthink, okay? Debbie responded, but she found Colleen strange. When they moved to the safe passage, Colleen stopped walking and reminded her, Debbie, you don't have to get angry with Carlos because of Megan. That will save you unnecessary stress. Colleen, what are you trying to tell me? I don't understand. Colleen laughed and said, Right, I was so anxious I forgot that you had only seen Megan a few times. Then she lowered her voice and said to Debbie, I don't know what that girl is up to. You know what? Wesley's girlfriend, well, sort of girlfriend, got engaged to someone else mostly because of her. Debbie was shocked by the news. She knew Colleen was talking about Megan. Afterwards, Curtis and I argued a couple of times too, all because of her. I don't mean to talk about her behind her back, but she's too manipulative. You never know what she is thinking. Anyway, be careful. Don't get into disagreements with Carlos over her. Otherwise, you will only give her what she wants. Okay? Finally, Debbie understood what she meant. If she is so awful, why can't the four of them see it? It struck her as odd that a whole four men still doted on Megan, even with full knowledge of her manipulation. Were they blind? They are men. Only women can see through other women's deep-buried dark thoughts. In their eyes, Megan is an innocent, adorable girl. An angel. They never think badly of her. Nor do they believe that she will stir up things among us, said Colleen, shrugging with resignation. If what she said was true, then Megan was really a horrible person. I wonder what she is up to, Debbie said honestly. Who knows? Sometimes she acts as if she likes Wesley, but she also keeps a technical distance from him. Sometimes it looks that she is into Carlos, but she never takes much initiative. But Damon and Curtis are almost old enough to be her father. She is unlikely to set her mind on them. Debbie felt tired of trying to figure out what was on Megan's mind. Now is not a convenient time to talk. I will invite you to tea some other time. Think about what I just told you. Don't say a word to those four, or else they will think that we are scheming against their innocent, adorable little Megan, Colleen cautioned. Her last remark was full of irony. It feels great to finally get these words out of my chest. I have been dying to talk to someone, but there was no one, and now I can talk to you. Debbie, women know women the best. Between you, me, and Megan, you are the most innocent, adorable soul. I'd fancy having you for a friend, just to enjoy your polite company over a cup of tea, or even on a shopping spree. Debbie was surprised by Colleen's comments.
I'm innocent.
And adorable. Colleen, you can't be more wrong. Anybody can be innocent but me. Okay, let's go back. And one more thing, you're really special to Carlos. Cherish what you have, said a visibly amused Colleen, to Debbie's surprise. When she first met her, Colleen was such an elegant socialite diva. Debbie's memory flashed back to how the girl had dazzled at Megan's birthday party. A hot cougar on the dance floor, Colleen was quite a name. But today, she was so approachable and witty. This girl has a whole mix of different graces. Debbie thought, what next surprise will I discover about her next time? Debbie's mind ran on. Gently, she shook her head and smiled. When the two women went back to the ward hand in hand, Megan was lying in bed, surrounded by the four gorgeous men. Every woman's dream. Seeing the two women walk back in, Curtis and Carlos came to meet them. Carlos pulled Debbie away from Colleen to himself and asked, "Where were you?" Debbie put on a smile and answered, "We went to the bathroom." Curtis pretended to be surprised. "You two went to the bathroom together? Since when did you become so close?" Colleen joked, "Debbie and I really hit off. We may wear the same pair of pants someday." Whether what Colleen had said about Megan was true or not, Debbie felt comfortable around her, so she echoed, "Right, I'll try to lose weight from now on to fit Colleen's pants, if it comes to that." Despite knowing they were just joking, Carlos still felt unhappy about what they had said. "My wife will never wear somebody else's pants." Feigning a sulky look, he put his hand on Debbie's waist and pinched her. "Lose weight? You should put on some weight," he thought to himself. Amused at the serious face he was making, Colleen giggled and said to Debbie, "In Carlos you have a model husband, someone worth keeping by any means." "Really? I don't see it," said Debbie to Colleen, rolling her eyes at Carlos, whose hand was still sliding back and forth on her waist. "I think you know it. You're just too embarrassed to admit it. The way you're blushing betrays you," Colleen retorted as she leaned into Curtis' arms, laughing. Pretending to be angry, Debbie stared at Colleen and then said to Curtis, "Mr. Liu, keep your woman in line." "No problem," Curtis promised crisply. Debbie gave Colleen a cocky smile. At this point, Damon put in curtly, "Can you two couples get lost as soon as possible? Why can't you just keep your lovey-dovey down a notch in front of the single? Why don't you just bring Adriana back and floss on us with the sweetness between you two?" Carlos retorted. That line didn't go down well with Damon. If anything, it cut him deep at heart like a knife. Although he didn't say a word, his face darkened. Seeing the brooding look on Damon's face, Debbie felt bad. She tugged at Carlos' sleeve. Carlos knew what she meant. He looked at her with a frown. Is she feeling bad for Damon? He thought unhappily, a little jealous. Assured that Megan was fine, Carlos and Curtis left the ward with their women. After their cars drove out of the hospital, they went in different directions. In the next 2 days, Carlos didn't go to the company. He worked at home. Debbie had offered to take care of him at home, but he sent her to school. As he had demanded, Debbie didn't skip a single class. On the 3rd day, Debbie and Casey waited on the playground for Jared and Dixon to come to the classroom with them. A few minutes passed, but the boys didn't show up. To kill time, the girls chatted as they were waiting. Then all of a sudden, Debbie spotted 2 familiar figures in front of the office building. Is that Carlos? Isn't he supposed to be resting at home? Is he fit enough to teach already? She wondered. "Debbie, what are you looking at?" someone asked in a soft voice. Debbie rolled her eyes upon hearing that voice. Gail was everywhere on campus, always following her like an annoying shadow. "What's it to you?" Debbie retorted. She was wondering why Carlos hadn't told her he was coming here. But then, a light bulb came on in her head. She glanced at Gail, who was so excited to see Carlos that she was close to tears. No wonder Debbie keeps looking over there. "It's Mr. Huo. I'm not dreaming. He's here. I'm seeing Mr. Huo again." Gail thought, her eyes reddening. The 2 men, Carlos and Curtis, were so handsome they made a magnificent sight when they stood together. More and more eyes were drawn to them. BN. A universe of stories awaits. Debbie patted Gail's shoulder. The girl was bathed in happiness now that she saw her dream man. "What?" she asked, so excited that the grin on her face didn't vanish even when she turned to face Debbie. Standing next to Gail didn't make Debbie explode with rage this time, which was odd. She pointed at Carlos and said calmly, "Look, Carlos." Gail rolled her eyes and snorted, "I'm not blind." Ignoring her hostility, Debbie raised her voice and suggested, "Care to make a bet?" "Why would I do that?" Gail intended to say, "Have you lost your mind?" But she remembered she had a public image to maintain and bit back that retort. "Don't you always want me to make a fool of myself? I'm giving you a chance. Remember the last time you set me up and I ended up embarrassing myself at Carlos Huo's launch event? Now that he's here, are you really going to miss such an opportunity to humiliate me again?" Debbie coaxed her. Gail moved closer to Debbie with an innocent, sweet smile on her face. But what she said was neither innocent nor sweet. "Of course not. I won't miss any opportunity to screw things up for you. It's so much fun," she whispered in Debbie's ear. Debbie took a step back to put some distance between them. Gail was not alone. A few of her friends were with her. Debbie looked at them and said, "How about this? I'll go confess to Carlos again. If he doesn't turn me down, then you'll have to apologize to me loudly 10 times and sing Bad Romance in a public place. Your friends too." Gail's friends were surprised by the idea. At first, Casey was confused about what Debbie was trying to do, but now she found the idea hilarious. To help Debbie out, she held her arm and said anxiously, "Debbie, are you crazy? Have you forgotten how he treated you last time? Don't do anything stupid. Relax, Casey. It'll go better than last time. Believe me. Everyone will be watching after all." Debbie raised her voice as she said the last sentence. Right, a bunch of students will be there, Gail thought. Everybody in Y City knew how ruthless Carlos was. If she recalled right, Debbie had even been tossed into the ocean to drown. She loved imagining how humiliating it would be for Debbie if Carlos rejected her right to her face and threw her out of university. However, Gail didn't fall for Debbie's trick easily. She sensed that something was off. "But we aren't that close to Mr. Huo. How do we know what went on between you?" "Easy. I'll face you. To make sure I won't cheat, you can see what I'm saying." "How does that sound?" Debbie had been seeking revenge, and now the chance had presented itself. Nonetheless, Gail turned her down. Her friends, on the other hand, urged her to agree. "Gail, that's Mr. Huo. If Debbie does this, she has a death wish. What could go wrong? Don't you want to see what he does? If he kills her, we get a show," a girl said. Debbie gasped. "What a cold bitch. She even wants to see me die." "But," Gail faltered. She recalled last time they were at the mall. She and Debbie fought over the collar pin. Judging from what happened that day, Debbie and Carlos seemed to have a special connection. Sensing Gail's uncertainty, Debbie decided to play up her gift for acting. She whispered in Casey's ear, "I hope he forgot what he said last time. He promised to bury me alive if I ever got him mad." It was a stage whisper, pitched perfectly so that Gail could hear it, and her friends couldn't. Casey acted shocked and pulled her aside. "You out of your mind, tomboy? If he really said this, maybe he meant it. I don't want to watch you die." As they were whispering to each other, Gail broke in. "What are you waiting for? He might leave any minute." Debbie instantly stopped talking and pretended to be surprised. "What? You agreed to it? I was just stringing you along. No way would I do that." Seeing how frightened Debbie was, Gail's friends gloated. "You can't back out now, Debbie. Right? What's the matter? You chicken." They kept taunting her and egging her on. Debbie took a deep breath and walked towards Carlos with a dozen girls watching. Curtis and Carlos were talking about the incident involving Megan. Curtis told Carlos, "Wesley has taken care of everything. Just take some time to recover and come back when you're ready. I always wondered why you agreed to teach here even though you're uber busy. Now I get it. There's someone you like here." Carlos smiled. "I have to come. My wife is such a pain. But you," Carlos had intended to ask, "you seem to care about Debbie a lot." "Why?" A sweet voice interrupted him. "Hi, Mr. Huo. Mr. Liu. The familiar voice made Carlos' smile widen. Curtis waved at the girl. Debbie, come here. As an educator, Curtis was urbane in his every movement. Debbie trotted over to them and stood where she could see Gale. Carlos checked the time and asked, 2 minutes to class. Shouldn't you be on your way? Debbie didn't answer his question. She could sense annoyance in his tone, but she ignored it. Instead, she looked at Curtis with embarrassment and asked, Mr. Liu, could you please give us a minute? You want to talk to your husband in private? Curtis asked. Debbie nodded with a giggle. Kinda, but I only need him for a minute. Or maybe you could just stand around. Curtis looked at her lovingly and said with resignation, Your minute starts now. Then he turned his back to the couple. Looking at her expressionless husband, Debbie smiled mischievously, which confused her man. The next second, she snuggled into his arms and shouted, Carlos Huo, I like you. I really like you. She had shouted so loudly Gale didn't have to read her lips to know what she was saying, for her voice could be heard from tens of meters away. The other girls watched her, their mouths agape. Even Jared and Dixon, who had arrived at the scene late, were astounded. When did she get so brave? Carlos had been a little unhappy about Debbie being late for class, but her confession of feelings filled his heart with joy. However, when he looked at her, he noticed that she was staring at something. He turned back and noticed a group of students were watching them. Immediately, he realized that the confession was just part of some game his wife was playing. But he didn't seem to mind. He pulled her back into his arms and said, I've heard what you said. Now go to your class. Seeing what was happening, Gale was so shocked she couldn't feel her legs anymore. She collapsed onto one of her friends and wondered, what on earth is Debbie's relationship with Carlos Huo? Not only didn't he push her away, but he actually hugged her. There must be something going on between them. Having achieved her goal, Debbie wriggled out of Carlos' arms and apologized to Curtis, who was looking at them in disbelief. I'm sorry that you had to hear my confession of feelings again, Mr. Liu. I'm going to my class now. Bye. She had hardly turned around before Carlos took her by the wrist and said, I'll pick you up after class this afternoon. With her mind totally on Gale, she replied casually, okay. Carlos watched as Debbie left. He was sure that his wife had just used him as a pawn, but he still looked happy. Curtis laughed. I should have listened to her and left. Carlos responded flatly, I'm going back to my company. My classes will be resumed next week as scheduled. His wife was still a little imp. He had to put more effort into her. Curtis patted his shoulder. I'm looking forward to the day when you will address me differently. Carlos raised his eyebrows in confusion. Perhaps I should do a background check on you and my wife. Sensing his jealousy, Curtis waved his hand and said, There's no need for that. You will know it sooner or later. You just need to believe that I won't harm her. When the bell rang, Carlos got into the vehicle and Ashley started the engine. The Rolls-Royce Phantom slowed to a stop when it reached Debbie. Then the black-tinted window was rolled down and revealed Carlos' handsome face. All the girls that were around held their breaths in anticipation. However, Carlos only had eyes for one. He reproached, Think about what you could do to get me to forgive you for being several minutes late for class. Everyone that was around was stunned to hear what he said. The way he spoke to Debbie was totally different. How about I treat you to dinner? Debbie quickly blurted out, I don't accept bribery. He turned her down flatly. The window was wound up again and the Rolls-Royce sped away. Once the vehicle had left, Debbie's classmates surrounded her and bombarded her with questions about what her relationship with Carlos was. When did you meet Mr. Huo? Someone asked. Why didn't he reject you? Wondered another student. While she was texting Carlos, Debbie answered them casually, Oh, about that. Well, once Gail apologizes to me and you guys sing Bad Romance, I'll explain it all to you. She pressed send, and the message read, Mr. Handsome, I'm sprinting to the classroom now. Can you forgive me? He simply replied, Do I need to show you the surveillance footage of your school? Debbie pulled a face towards the phone, meant for Carlos. He indeed knew her well. Some girls crowded around Gail, asking her to apologize to Debbie. Gail assumed a sad face and wrung out some tears, hoping to get off lightly. But the girls weren't buying it. They wanted her to do it as soon as possible, so they could hear all about Carlos and Debbie's relationship. Gail had no other choice but to do what Debbie had asked of her. So she took a deep breath and put her head back, shouting 10 times, Debbie, I'm sorry. Hearing that, Debbie had a big smile on her face, as pleased as punch. Embarrassing the person that she hated really made her day, especially since Gail was always picking on her. The girls were supposed to then stand under the national flag and sing the song, Bad Romance. Since classes had already begun, there were only a few students passing by that would hear them. Gail wanted to chicken out, but the girls couldn't stand the suspense any longer. They were eager to find out the juicy information about Carlos and Debbie. So they grabbed Gail and dragged her under the national flag and sang the song. The scene went viral on the school forum. However, when the girls asked Debbie about her relationship with Carlos, she simply said, Why don't you ask him? After that, she turned on her heels and walked away. The girls were left speechless and furious. Immerse yourself in the Storyverse. Soon, rumors about Debbie and Carlos traveled around the campus. The most popular version was that Debbie hooked up with Carlos Huo and was his mistress. And another was how she confessed her love for Carlos Huo on campus but was turned down. Debbie and her friends had hardly sat down in the last row of the classroom when Carlos sent her a message. Did you have fun? Debbie was puzzled. She texted back, What do you mean? What were you doing just now? Replied Carlos. Debbie realized that he already knew about what had happened between her and Gail. She looked around half expecting to see him there. How did he do that? Does he have 6 pairs of eyes? She wondered. After what had happened that day, no one on campus dared to mess with Debbie again. So she finally enjoyed some peace. However, on the flip side of the matter, she had to deal with a girl who was standing in front of her and expressing her feelings for Carlos. Debbie, I really am crazy about Mr. Huo. I have liked him for more than 10 years. Can you give me his WeChat or Facebook account? Debbie sat up frowning and replied, I don't have it. You can ask him yourself in his class the next time you see him. She was telling the truth. All she had was his phone number. To her surprise, the shy girl suddenly made a hideous face and said sarcastically, I thought you were close to Mr. Huo. Turns out you don't even have his contact information. How dare you pretend to be his woman? Damn it! Debbie couldn't help cursing under her breath. Then she slapped the table and demanded, What the heck do you mean by pretending to be his woman? Don't you dare to leave before you explain yourself. Her classmates fled the classroom one after another when they saw her flare up. Was this the same graceful girl who had danced at the Solar New Year's Gala? They all wondered. The other girl was terrified. Even without Carlos, Debbie was scary enough. The girl swallowed and stammered. It is said that you are Mr. Huo's woman. Didn't you start the rumor? People also say that you hugged Mr. Huo. Is it true? The girl stared at Debbie curiously. No, it's not, Debbie replied firmly. Then Jared took out his cell phone and showed her the picture on his phone, at which Debbie suddenly became speechless. Someone had photographed the scene where she had hugged Carlos and expressed her feelings for him and uploaded it on the forum. It had racked up countless views and likes. Now that Debbie had had her revenge on Gail, nothing else mattered. As for the man in the picture online, she declared, That's not Carlos Huo. That's my boyfriend. She believed that making her relationship with Carlos public would only bring herself more trouble. Hearing her words, her friends thought to themselves, "Come on, that is Carlos Huo." The girl who had come to ask for Carlos' contact information left the classroom with doubts of her own. Debbie took out her phone and complained to Carlos. "Mr. Huo, your fans are totally crazy. If they want your contact information, why didn't they just ask you in person while you had classes at school? Now that they know I know you, they keep coming to me for all kinds of information. Not even half a day has passed and crazy fan number 33 found me in the classroom. This is madness." She didn't get any reply for a while. Half an hour later, her phone buzzed. "You should get used to it because I might make your identity as Mrs. Huo public anytime. If he did that, more girls would try to find her. And this time, they would be pissed off that Mr. Huo was off the market." She shivered at the thought of their reaction to the news. "Mr. Huo, please have some mercy on me. Let's keep this low-key. Just like how it was 3 years ago," she pleaded. Carlos smiled at the other end of the phone. "Deb, it's too late for that now," he replied. "The moment I lost my heart to you, I knew that you were the one. You are mine and you are not going anywhere. I want you by my side for the rest of our lives and I can't wait to tell the whole world that you are my wife," he thought to himself. Debbie, on the other hand, was terrified by what would happen once everybody knew she was Carlos's wife. She totally freaked out when another one of Carlos' fans ran excitedly towards her. "Ark, I can't stand this anymore. It's driving me crazy. Whoever wants to be Mrs. Huo, please be my guest. I'm more than willing to give the title away." But then she pictured another woman dining with Carlos, traveling along with him, having fun with him, sleeping in his arms. Just imagining those scenes was enough to upset her immensely. That crushing feeling completely cleared her head. She knew what she wanted now. She shoved Carlos' enthusiastic fan aside and whispered to Jared, "I need money. Get me a job in some other bar. I need to sing." Jared stared at her for a moment and then shook his head. "You know what? You're insane. Your husband is generously rich. If this were some other woman, she would be busy enjoying her comfortable life. But you want to work part-time. What are you thinking?" Debbie was frustrated. "There's something that I want to buy. It will be more meaningful if I buy it with my own money," she explained. She only had around $20,000 left from the money she had made by drinking. It was enough to buy the thing that she wanted, but she could only afford the lesser version for that money, which wouldn't do. She only wanted the best for Carlos. She liked Carlos. There was no more doubting that truth. There was no hesitation in her. Since that was crystal clear in her heart now, she decided to show him how she felt about him before it was too late. She couldn't stand the thought of losing him. "Okay, I'll find another job for you, but no drinking. Can you promise me that?" The risk was too high for Jared. Carlos would probably skin him alive if he found out that Debbie got drunk again. "Yes, cross my heart," Debbie promised, patting her chest. Carlos picked her up after school. They went to a hotel for dinner. That evening, she was unusually sweet to him. During dinner, she asked him about his day and showed concern about the recovery of his wound. She picked up his food for him, and she even massaged Carlos' back diligently even though he told her there was no need for it. The Epsilon B.N. A universe of stories awaits. When they both finally sat down to eat, Carlos put some boneless fish on her plate and said, "There's no use sucking up to me. I still remember that you were late for class today." She squirmed in her seat. That really brought her spirits down. Head bowed, Debbie poked the fish with her chopsticks with a frown on her face. Then she said with a sigh, "No horror movies and no Martyr's Cemetery. Okay? Okay." Carlos agreed readily. His response came as a pleasant surprise to Debbie. She was thrilled, but before she could swallow the next bite of her delicious fish, he said, "I'm taking you to watch a live show. A person making out with a snake." And no, she objected desperately, her eyes wide open and filled with horror. She had seen that horrendous scene before. There was no way in hell that Carlos would let her go with just making her watch the show. Her legs started trembling as memories of the previous incident emerged in her head. Once she had gone to Thailand on a holiday with her friends. Human and snake kissing was one of the shows on the itinerary. Disgusted and terrified by the show, she had hidden behind a column and played with her phone during the duration of the entire show. When she raised her head towards the end of the show, she saw Jared making out with the snake. She was so frightened that her phone was tossed away when she jumped out of her seat. After they had returned from the trip, she avoided Jared for half a month. At this point, Debbie already knew that Carlos made sure that every one of his punishments was harsh and effective to the people who angered him. Even Debbie, his own wife, wouldn't be spared. He was a cold man. All of a sudden, the tender, flavorful fish tasted incredibly bland. "Is there any way that you would let this one go?" Carlos gave her a glance as he picked out the fish bones for her. "That depends on your performance." After she heard his words, an idea dawned on her. She stood up from her chair abruptly and locked her arms around his neck. She then looked him in the eye and slammed her lips on his 3 times. That would definitely help her get through, she thought. However, the man's face darkened and frowned. "Debbie Nian, did you wipe your mouth after eating?" Debbie bit her lips and looked elsewhere. That hadn't occurred to her. An innocent mistake. But it was not too late for her. She could still make up for it. She quickly drew a tissue and was about to wipe her mouth when it hit her that it might be wiser to wipe the tyrant's mouth first. So, she gently wiped her husband's mouth with a grin and then her own. After throwing the tissue into the bin, she wrapped his neck from behind and asked, "Mr. Handsome, do I get an A for my performance?" I didn't feel much sincerity. Perfunctory kisses don't satisfy me. Frustrated, Debbie buried her face in his neck and rubbed it back and forth. Her breath drifted lightly against his skin. Carlos' hand stopped in midair. This woman is doing it intentionally, he thought. He slowly put down the chopsticks and wiped his mouth and hands clean with a wet napkin. The next second, Debbie was pulled into his arms and seated on his lap. She looked at the door nervously, her face red. But they were in a private booth, so no one would come and interrupt them. Carlos took her hand in his and then pulled her in for a deep kiss on the lips. His tongue was restless in her mouth. His breathing became heavier and heavier. He whispered to her in a husky voice, "Let's go home, shall we?" "Yes," came her swift answer. She was aware of what he meant. Compared with making out with a snake, kissing Carlos sounded like a much better choice. So she had agreed to it without thinking when he had suggested that they go home. Carlos didn't even wait for her to finish her dinner before dragging her out of the hotel and heading home. What would happen after they got home was way too exciting for Debbie. Too embarrassed to look at Carlos, she kept her head down and pretended to play with her phone, flushing as she thought about the impending scene. When they were about to arrive at the villa, Carlos' phone rang suddenly. Debbie raised her head and saw the caller ID on the LED screen of the vehicle backup camera. Megan. Carlos answered the call immediately. "Hi, Megan." Megan sounded scared and anxious as she blurted out, "Uncle Carlos, there are some men at the gate of my housing community. They seem to be looking for something or someone. I've been waiting for them to leave for half an hour, but they are still here. What should I do?" Carlos' face turned dark in worry and fury. He steered the wheel while saying, "Go to the security guard's room and wait for me. I'm on my way." "Okay, but hurry," Megan urged. "Okay." By the time the call ended, the excitement and sweetness in Debbie's heart had died away. It must be those men from last time. We're going to Megan's place to pick her up, Carlos said in a hurry. Wait, just drop me here at the roadside, Debbie said. She didn't want to see Megan, nor did she intend to stop Carlos going. Carlos looked at her and sensed the change of her mood, but he didn't know what she was unhappy about. Honey, if those men take Megan, she will be in danger, he explained patiently. But Debbie didn't respond. When they arrived at the gate of Megan's housing community, the girl was cringing in a chair in the security guard's room, holding her legs. Megan, Carlos called. At his voice, Megan raised her head, ran towards him, and held him tightly. Uncle Carlos, I'm so glad you're here. I was scared out of my wits. Don't be afraid. I'm here. Carlos comforted her gently. Seeing her husband holding another woman was bad enough, but his soft, warm, consoling tone made Debbie feel even worse. Some people used to say that her husband had a ruthless, cold soul, but not to everybody, it seemed. Gently, he picked Megan up and carried her towards the car. Open the door, he ordered the security guards. Yes, Mr. Huo, answered the guards in unison as one of them darted to open the back door quickly. Then he turned to Debbie, who had quietly stood by, watching. Thank God. He hadn't forgotten about her yet. Deb, get in, please. Debbie didn't want to get in the car. Thankfully, as she was wondering what to do, her phone rang. Hi, Tomboy. I'm calling just to ask where you bought the red wine last time, said Casey. What? You're drunk? Where are you? Okay, I'm coming to pick you up, Debbie said on the phone. Casey was confused. She took her phone away from her ear and checked the service, which was good. No, Tomboy, I am asking. Oh, you are at home. Okay, stay put and wait for me. I'm on my way. Before Casey could respond, Debbie hung up. She looked at Carlos, who was waiting for her to get in the car, and said apologetically, Sorry, Casey is drunk at home. She is in a really bad mood right now. I have to go check on her. I'll stay at her place tonight. Staring at her, Carlos didn't say anything back. Megan, who was in his arms, clutched his shirt and said, Debbie, go ahead if you have something to attend to. I'm already feeling much better and I don't see the need to hold you around. I'll watch over Uncle Carlos for you, just in case you're worried about him. Debbie was startled at the girl's nerve. This manipulative bitch. Okay, bye, she said and left in a huff. When she turned around, she hoped he'd call her or stop her. Stop me. If you stop me, I'll get in the car and go back to the villa with you. But till a cab stopped in front of her, he didn't call her or come to her to ask her to stay. Carlos put Megan in the back seat and said, Have a rest. I'll go. He intended to tell Debbie that he wanted to drive her to Casey's himself. However, before he could even finish his sentence, Megan grabbed his sleeve and said in a feeble voice, Uncle Carlos, I'm not feeling well. I think I need to take the medicine. All right, do you have any of the drugs with you? Asked Carlos. Why, yes, Megan answered, pointing at her bag with great difficulty. After Carlos had given her the medicine, he turned to look for Debbie, but she was long gone. Carlos was so upset he felt like cursing. Debbie called Casey in the cab and asked, What did you call me for just now? Casey didn't answer. She asked instead, What's going on with you? Listlessly, Debbie replied, Not much. Where are you? What are you doing? I'm at a friend's party. I called to ask you where you bought the red wine last time. It really tasted great. Could we have some bottles delivered here? Casey asked without a pause. Only then did Debbie notice the noises at the other end of the phone. Someone was singing, Discover, Devour, Delight. Quickly, She gave Casey the address and hung up. Then she called Jared. "Where are you?" "In a bar. Looking for a job for you." "Where else can I be?" Jared replied resignedly. "A dog with full mouth does not bark." He had taken a VIP card from Carlos, so he felt obliged to take matters concerning Debbie more seriously. "How is it going?" "It's just settled. The manager is an acquaintance of mine, and he has agreed to pay you $100 per hour. I was going to call you. When can you come for an audition?" To be honest, the pay was good. Some bars paid $200 or $300 a night. "I can go there right now." Jared gave her the address. When Debbie got to the bar, Jared took her straight to the manager. The manager had heard from Jared that Debbie had a very powerful background, so he looked at her more carefully. Assessing her strong points, the manager was impressed by the confident aura and natural beauty. The only shortcoming was her low-key dressing, which didn't go with the ambience of the bar. But that didn't matter as long as she could sing, and she blew him away with that melodious voice. When she took to the stage, guitar in hand, one might have dismissed her for just another wannabe. But the moment she strummed the first chords on her guitar and belted out the first words of her song, the whole bar fell quiet in awe. By the time she was done, the audience was rapturous. The more sentimental ones among them pulled out handkerchiefs to wipe teary eyes. The manager, reading his patrons, requested her to sing something more cheerful to set a different tone for the night. From many years of experience, he knew how to play on their moods and make them keep buying. On the manager's suggestion, a certain girl in the audience requested, "Move your body." So Debbie picked that for her next act. With smooth progression, she hit the refrain to another round of applause. The girl who had requested the song was ecstatic. When she's second song was over, Debbie took a brief rest, during which she suggested to the manager, "The customers can request any song at a tip of $200. We will split the amount collected between you and me. What do you say?" The manager gave her a complicated look. He suspected mischief in Jared's recommendation for Debbie. If the girl, our ally, had a strong background, how come she seemed almost desperate to make money? Even so, the manager agreed to her proposal. He motioned a host over and had him announce their arrangement on the stage. Her charming presence on stage drew barflies, eager to impress her. Men trying to request a song forced their ways through the crowd towards the stage. "Everglow," "I Do," "No Promises," "Against All Odds," "Better in Time," "Wings." She went through the requests with breathtaking finesse, ending each performance to a wild round of applause. She had colluded with Casey and devised their lies before she came to the bar. In case Carlos called Casey, she would throw him off the scent. When Casey ended the call, Debbie forthwith switched her phone off and immersed herself in the music. From 9 p.m. to 2 a.m., the tips went higher and higher. Despite the high price, Debbie's charming persona on stage worked to her advantage. The number of men trying to woo her by requesting songs seemed endless, and she just kept going for hours until Jared, noticing she was drained, came to drag her off the stage. That night she had made a killing. In self-congratulation, she kissed the bucks with a satisfied smile. "It's unbelievable racking up so much on a single night out," she said to Jared, who was watching her, equally blown away. When they were alone, Jared couldn't help asking, "What exactly are you trying to buy? I've never seen you bust your ass like this." Debbie cleared her throat and said, "I'll tell you later, but not now." Jared rolled his eyes and snarled, "Friendship over." Debbie patted his shoulder and comforted him. "Relax. Once I've made enough money, I'll never come to this place again. Then you won't have to worry anymore. It's good you can think like that. If you make any more trouble, your husband will skin me alive. How about I lend you the money you need so that you don't have to sing here anymore?"